Hi, I'm Angela Bowie. You know, I remember exactly where and when David Bowie and I first slept together. It was in London in the early summer of 1968, after an evening at the Speakeasy. The night King Crimson celebrated their new recording contract, and Donovan got up and sang Buddy Holly songs with them. Just another wild, wonderful rock and roll night. And David came back with me to my little room above the Nomad Travel Club in Paddington. What a scene that was. A South African owner, a wrestler from Lebanon who worked security, a waitress from Newcastle who was a great singer, a band from Mexico who were huge pop stars at home, but nobodies in London, a dozen other assorted stars and reprobates, and my Australian roommate and I. It was too wild. Swinging London, seamy side up. That night it was just David and I, though. Well, unless, of course, you include the much-fabled Lance of Love. Lance was such an active, popular fellow. He never met a stranger. Probably never will. You could make a good case for his being a whole separate character in his own right. David was pretty drunk, and we were both pretty exhausted when we fell into my little bed together. But instead of sleep, here came Lance, strong, silent, and suddenly running the show. It was, I must admit, impressive. Hardly heavenly, although Lance was long on stamina as well as just plain long. He was short on sensitivity, but a convincing performance in David's terms. His pride in the size and staying power of his sexual equipment was quite obviously justified. The morning brought another insight. David left me early, and he was very abrupt about it. It was as if he were saying, "That was then, this is now. I have to get back to what I have to do." It infuriated me, but I understood what was going on. For David, there was no sentiment involved. What he'd done with me was a piece of work, just a part of the overall plan he was putting together. I'm sure that after he left me that morning, he went on to see Ken Pitt, Calvin Markley, and probably a couple of pieces of trade on the side. But that was okay. It was like having a really mischievous cat. You may hate it, but you don't love it any the less. And that was David. Just a bad, bad cat. That's how he acted. He used sex the way a cat sprays, to mark his territory. It gets the job done. Let me tell you about swinging London. London in 1966 was wonderful, the world's greatest city at one of its highest points. It was a place emerging from the dark into the light. It felt open, free, optimistic, and ready for anything. The entire culture, it seemed, was changing. The Beatles and the Stones and the Who had kicked holes in the old British barriers of class, decorum, and inhibition. The stars of the media weren't lords and ladies or the chosen favorites of the elite, but unpedigreed pop stars, artists, models, photographers, designers, whoever had the look or the sound or the attitude. For a few years in the 60s, London was just a gas. Beautiful, safe, prosperous, creative, wide open and wild. You could get whatever turned you on. Peace and love, power and money, pomp and prestige, art and culture, hash or speed, call girls and rent boys. Sex was at the heart of it, just as it was in Paris and Amsterdam and New York and San Francisco, the other power stations on our generation's cultural energy circuit. When people discuss the 60s today, they tend to ignore the sex. More respectable topics, such as drugs and politics and war and music, get all the airtime. But let's be honest, sex is what really drove us, the same way it drives people today. And in our case, sex wasn't just new, but newly safe. We had more sexual freedom than anyone in living memory. And even better, we had more than we ourselves had ever imagined we could have. The pill seemed to have dropped suddenly into our lives from a clear blue heaven. So it may come as a small surprise when I admit that in London in the late summer of 1966, at fully 16 years of age, I was still a virgin. I didn't go all the way until a short while after dinner on my 18th birthday, when after 3 glasses of champagne, my virginity and I parted company in an Austin Healey parked outside a pub overlooking the River Thames. Car and penis both belonged to a terrifically nice graduate student from Yorkshire. That was good. But in many ways the term virginity is relative, and in many ways I had lost mine at 16, not 18. At 16 I had fallen in love for the first time, and had my first orgasm with another person. Her name was Lorraine. I'm bisexual, in some circles famously so. My open marriage with David Bowie, the stances he and I took, the philosophies we embraced and championed, these are matters of record in the history of the modern struggle for sexual liberation. David and I may in fact have been the best-known bisexual couple ever. We were certainly the most famous couple ever to admit and celebrate our bisexuality so publicly. So if you didn't know before, you know now. So as 1966 edged into 1967, the summer of love in swinging London, I knew better than most people my age how things stood on the sexual front. I grasped very clearly and personally that conventional morality, the body of law and custom penalizing anything but monogamy and heterosexuality, was against nature and against the spirit of human love. It was a fearful, vindictive sham, and I wanted no part of it. I wanted freedom. David Bowie helped me obtain it, and I helped him, and together we helped the world. My first image of David was enticing, a Polaroid of him posed naked, shot from the groin up. He was very pretty. That was an intriguing photograph, and so was the man who had taken it, Dr. Calvin Mark Lee. Oh, Calvin. Now there was a character, San Francisco Chinese, very beautiful, very sensitive, very clever. The doctor stood for a Ph.D. in philosophy and as hip as they come. He was an A&R man for Mercury Records, but Calvin's real vocation was as a collector. He collected people, and not just any people. He wanted the chic, the exotic, the unconventional, the dedicated leaders of fashion, the androgynous. London in 1966 and 1967 was full of those people, and Calvin would find them in all the likely places, which were also the places his job took him to. He would easily walk up and take a likely candidate into that soft, sweet snare of his. Ooh, what a wonderful jacket. Where did you get it? Really? You know, there's an exhibit opening next week. I'm sure you'd really love... The Polaroids on the wall in his studio attested to his success. There were somewhere between 50 and 100 of them, all jammed together, boys and girls. Calvin had already slept with David Bowie, but he wanted more. He wanted him in a business sense, too. He wanted to sign him to Mercury Records. First, though, he had to convince his boss, Lou Reisner, that a very odd avant-pop commodity like David could sell big tickets. And then he had to outfox David's manager, the ghastly Ken Pitt. Connected with sufficient intimacy to David, I could be useful in both enterprises. David was a rotten boyfriend at first, or at least not the boyfriend I wanted him to be. I was still at the age when a girl assumes her lover is going to be nice to her, even if he isn't faithful. But David was cold. One night I remember when I was all worked up about some slight of his, in my very best theatrical manner, I tumbled tragically down the flight of stairs outside my room at the Nomad Travel Club. He simply stepped over me on his way out and said, "Well, when you feel like it, if you're not dead, call me." And naturally I did. I was falling in love, and love is blind. A turning point came in our relationship, though, and it was David who initiated it. He called me one day and said he was dreadfully sick and wanted to be with me, So could I please come down and take care of him? That night we sat on his bed and he started playing me tapes of his music. All of it. All the different versions of the tracks he'd been working on for his first album for Mercury. A sense of amazement came over me. I'd heard some of the songs before, but only in bits and pieces, never with such intensity. Now I listened with wonder to one gem after another. These weren't the usual boy meets girl, girl loses boy pop songs, but loaded little views into the real drama of life, amazingly original, precise and poetic. And their author sitting next to me on the bed wasn't just another pretty pop face, or for that matter, just another rotten boyfriend. This was a special man, different and great, one in a million or more, a man with a rare and beautiful gift, a star in this world. A new sense of who David was came flooding into me. He was also behaving in a new way, acting kind and sympathetic towards me. And when we made love, he was delicate and sensitive, a much better lover than the stud I'd known up to then. We became intimate that night, revealing the parts of ourselves we'd been keeping hidden and safe. David talked about his childhood in the Brixton area of London, about his father, a gentle Yorkshireman who had worked for the last 15 years of his life as public relations man for Dr. Barnardo's, which is a children's home. About his firebrand mother, one of the first women in her town to wear trousers, who had had an illegitimate child, and about that child, Terry Burns, 9 years David's senior, and his great hero. David told me how he worshipped Terry and how Terry had been such a big influence on him, introducing him to music, politics, and poetry, and also to a haunting fear. Something had happened to Terry while he was serving in the Royal Air Force in Aden during one of Britain's last colonial wars, and whatever it was, it had disturbed him profoundly. Diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic, he was in and out of mental institutions until 1984, when he threw himself under a train. He was buried without his little brother in attendance. Terry was in a mental ward as David revealed himself to me that night, confessing to an awful dread that he might follow his half-brother's path. He had reason to worry, I think, as events were to demonstrate, but that night we were safe as houses together. We could be trusting and free. For my part, I could bear some truths about myself. I told him about my affair with Lorraine, and I made it plain to David that whatever I'd thought before, I was now no longer mainstream, no longer respectable, no longer interested in maintaining the status quo. Quite the reverse, in fact. I told him I was ready, willing, and eager to stand up and be counted. And indeed, so much did begin. The wild, sexy, sorry saga of David and Angie and their pals in glitter. I don't know how much love David felt. I suspect very little, and that my main appeal to him was my potential as a nurse, cook, housekeeper, creative ally, and business advisor. But I know I was falling hopelessly in love. Let's have a portrait of the man I had fallen for. Who exactly was David Bowie, and where had he come from? He was, exactly, David Robert Jones. Bowie came later, an exotically American, slightly dangerous new name to glamorize just another suburban English-singing boy. And David Robert Jones entered this world at 9 o'clock in the morning, on January the 8th, 1947, in the working-class district of Brixton. David was born into a reasonable facsimile of the middle class, his publicist father, John Jones, being the son of a successful Yorkshire shoe manufacturer, and his mother, Peggy Burns, having grown up one of an Irish Catholic professional soldier's 6 children in the genteel southwestern English town of Tunbridge Wells. I should add that the term middle class in England doesn't mean what it does in the United States. In England in the 50s, a thoroughly respectable middle-class family might or might not have owned a used car. They would have lived in a house that would qualify as a hovel in the United States, set on a minuscule piece of property in a neighborhood most Americans would describe as a slum. David's family really was odd. He was, for a start, born illegitimately. John Jones' divorce from his first wife had not become final. Peggy's history included another illegitimate child, Terry, born in 1937. John, too, had another child, Annette, whom he'd adopted in 1942 after an extramarital affair with a nurse. It's said that John was a drinker and a philanderer, and I have no trouble believing that. But I liked him. I found him intelligent, funny, down-to-earth, charming, and very supportive and loving toward David. I was greatly saddened by his death in 1969. Flaws and all, John was okay. Peggy, on the other hand, well, I had a problem with Peggy. I could empathize with her after John's death and make some allowances for her inability to handle herself. But even so, her diatribes against me, calling me a whore and a slut and every other word in the book, went beyond the acceptable into the contemptible, especially when you consider the lady's own youth. Yet she never really lost it, never got to the point at which she had to be taken away and locked up as others of her family had been and would be. Mental illness never prevented her from providing basic child care. Biographers, music critics, and other amateur psychologists have made much of those family circumstances in particular, and the Burns family madness in general, and to a certain extent I believe they've been on the money. I think David was indeed terrified of losing his wits the way Terry had lost his. Furthermore, I agree that David's Iceman persona and his great need for control were functions of his fear of emotionalism. Extreme emotions sent you out of control into madness, and so if you wanted to survive, you simply didn't get extremely emotional. That's why David's songwriting and his whole stance as an artist have been such an analytical, distanced affair. As a writer, he's chosen to avoid working from his feelings, instead approaching his material as an elegant anthropological exercise among you fascinating humans. And as a performer, he's chosen the even more impersonalizing tactic of creating fictional characters to present the finished work to the public. Ziggy Stardust, Aladdin Sane, the Thin White Duke, whoever. Which has worked, of course, and brilliantly. David's art has been fascinating, and God knows his commerce healthy enough. But personally, his flight from emotionalism has cost him dearly. His problem has been obvious enough. You simply can't have a life without strong emotion. The best you can do in that direction is to put on a convincing show, and that gets you only to dangerous places. Straight into emotional isolation and escalating paranoia, until more often than not, sooner or later, you arrive at the bright idea that medication, booze, dope, coke, smack, prescription drugs, whatever, will make it all feel better. What am I doing here? Describing a classic addict personality? Exactly. Moreover, if you want my opinion, and want it or not, you're getting it. David was never insane, the way most of us understand the term, despite the impression he's tried to create at various points in his career, and despite his period of very bizarre behavior in the mid-70s. David is, in fact, one of the most coldly calculating, tightly controlled human beings I've ever met. His only real psychological problem in the years I knew him was his emotional frigidity, the cure in his case being worse than the family disease. The really crazy stuff, the mania, delusions, and paranoia he exhibited during the second half of the decade I spent with him, coincided precisely with his ingestion of enormous amounts of cocaine, alcohol, and whatever other drugs he had on hand. His madness simply didn't happen unless he was stoned out of his mind. You know what recovering alcoholics say about themselves, that they're egomaniacs with inferiority complexes, and very deep down, where nobody was allowed to see it, I think that's what David was hiding. On that level, the David Bowie I met in 1968 was a poor, sick puppy headed more or less inevitably for a very hard time a few years down the road. But none of us knew then what we know now. We never do. And what I saw in David was anything but trouble. Or rather, it was all the right kind of trouble, and none of the wrong. An invitation to adventure, to the exotic, the fast lane, the wild side, and to something uniquely his, a wonderful combination of great delicacy and great strength. David was a very startling, sexy, unusual, and powerful young man. He was, as I've said, a beauty, a young man blessed with a lovely face and beautiful body. His face was perfectly structured to classical proportions, forehead to nose and nose to chin measurements being equal, with high, wide cheekbones pulled tightly down into a mischievously chiseled chin. His skin was creamy smooth, his beard very light, his hair ash blonde like mine, bordered his face in a halo of soft little curls, and his eyebrows as finely blonde as his hair, arched gracefully to frame that one divine asymmetry, one green eye and one blue, erotic and compelling. David stands between 5'10" and 5'11". His shoulders are broad like mine, and although he's always been slender, the sinew and muscle I saw in his arms and legs foretold the powerhouse I would find in his chest and pelvis. His fingers are long and artistic, with strong, squared-off fingernails, usually holding a cigarette. David speaks softly, and the timbre of his voice is rich and intelligent. It's an almost hypnotically effective instrument. Now you know David. Maybe you need to know some details about me. First, though, I want to clarify an issue about my years with David. I'm fully aware that lurking somewhere in most listeners' minds, there may be some doubt about me. Might I not be someone who shared David's life for a while, but was never really important in its creative and professional aspects, just another semi-relevant ex-spouse cashing in? The answer is that I was, in fact, very important indeed to the most creatively and commercially successful period of David's career. Many of the crucial business moves, musical and professional connections, and marketing and imaging strategies were my work, as were much of the time the daily minutiae. For a number of years, David's career was my job. I wasn't the girlfriend you might expect, the standard suburban British wannabe rock star's wannabe first wife. I was transcontinental and bilingual. I had Swiss schooling and theatrical experience, years of it, everything from the principles of direction to the nuts and bolts of lighting. And I knew how to really cook and really sew and really run a house. They turn out good old-fashioned ladies at expensive Swiss finishing schools, not half-baked girls. And of course, unlike David and his friends and associates, including the people in charge of managing and promoting him, I had 9/10 of a degree in marketing and more than enough savvy to make up for the missing piece of paper. So all the little shits who have denigrated my role in the launch of La Bowie, and all the chauvinist oinkers of every sex and stripe who at one time or another have dismissed me as the wife, can kiss my highly credentialed, much more than adequately competent ass, and feel damned lucky I let them. Okay? Do we have that straight? Let's hope so, and proceed with some biographical details. I was born Mary Angela Barnett, an American citizen, the daughter of George and Helena Marie Barnett, in Xeros on the Mediterranean island of Cyprus in 1949. My father's parents were American via England and Ireland. My mother's Galician. I have one brother, 16 years my senior, who works as a mining engineer in New Guinea. In that respect, he follows in the footsteps of our father, who spent most of his professional life as an engineer with the American-owned Cyprus Mining Corporation, after serving with the U.S. Army in World War II as a leader of guerrilla fighters in the Philippines. He was a much-decorated full colonel. Both my parents passed away in 1984. I was educated in Cyprus until I was sent to St. George's School, near Montreux in Switzerland at the age of 9. I graduated from St. George's at 16, spent a mercifully brief few months at Connecticut College for Women, and then studied marketing at Kingston Polytechnic in suburban London. So far in my life, I've lived in Cyprus, Switzerland, Connecticut, London, New York, Los Angeles, Northern California, Arizona, and I've spent significant amounts of time in Frankfurt, Berlin, Vienna, on the islands of Hydra, Mykonos, and Spetze. At this particular moment, I live in Atlanta, Georgia. I have 2 children. Stasha, born in 1980, lives with me. Her father is Andrew Bogdan Lipka, also known as Drew Blood, located in and around London these days. My son Joe, born to David and me in 1971, and then named Zoe, is in England. His father has had sole custody of him since our divorce became final on February the 8th, 1980. As I write, it's been 2 years since I talked to Joe and more than 10 since I talked to his father. When I think about how David and I were together and how we came apart, I keep returning to the matter of emotionalism, how he hid his feelings and denied his vulnerability all the way down through the depths of drug addiction to the destruction of our relationship and the threshold of his own death. In particular, I remember sitting with him in a cafe in Switzerland immediately after we signed some divorce papers. I was pretty far gone into the dark myself then, betrayed by my own flaws, certainly, but also worn away by years of David's coldness and broken by his final, ruthless campaign to erase me completely from his life, and I expected nothing from him but more of the same. I'd come to think of him as a person so utterly uninterested in loving or caring for me that he might as well have been my executioner. That's not how he acted, though. He was quite gentle and solicitous, even sweet, and he talked with openness and genuine regret about what had happened between us and how he'd behaved. It was almost as if he were trying to build a bridge back to me. That was so strange for me and so hard. I just didn't understand. Why was this conversation taking place now, with divorce papers in hand instead of 2 or 3 years before, when it might have meant something? I don't know. Maybe the therapy he was involved in was helping him reach his feelings at long last. Or maybe... oh, hell, I really don't know. He closed me down completely after that day, saying not a word to me since. So I'm just stabbing in the dark. 1969 was a very fine year. I smile when I remember those days, waking up wherever I'd gone to sleep, stuffing my used underwear in my shoulder bag and going without until I could get back to my flat and do laundry. I smile even more when I remember how David and I were together. We held hands and locked eyes a lot, and we were sweet. When we were in public or with our friends, we used to say to each other in your ear when we meant I love you. Shy about it. I was a young lady of leisure that summer. I was free and life was easy. David could become my focus then, and he did. And since his focus was recording his album at the Trident Studio in Soho, in the heart of London, that's where I spent a good many of my days. For David, it was a time of great clarity and creativity. The recording process of David Bowie was almost entirely pleasant, productive, and cooperative. The people he assembled for that album, his first with Tony Visconti and his first for Mercury, were typically wonderful. Tony was and is just brilliant. I love him both professionally and personally. An American abroad in his early 20s, he'd come a long way from Brooklyn. As he sat behind that console in the little Trident control room, he was already a very accomplished musician, songwriter, arranger, engineer, and producer. Tony was only a year or two older than David, but he was so much further into his professional career that he and David had a big brother-little brother relationship. Tony was terrifically hip, as transatlantic musical transplants tended to be, and sexily chic. Tony was a keeper. When David and I started living together, he and his girlfriend came and lived with us. Most days I would wait until the boys had finished recording or mixing for the day, and then David and I would roam. We'd visit Calvin in Chelsea or Ken Pitt on Manchester Street. One day David took me to Dana Gillespie's house. We banged on the door, and there she was, my new best friend. Dana is a great singer, songwriter, actress, athlete, and beauty, and her accomplishments ranged from winning a place on the British water skiing team to playing Mary Magdalene in the original West End production of Jesus Christ Superstar, to amassing a body of sexual expertise uncanny in one so young. She was something else. One look, and you were an instant fan. David had said, "You two are really going to get along," and he was right. I realized how well he knew me already. There was no physical resemblance between us, since I was built like a boy and she was very voluptuous, but we both knew we were in this world to celebrate it, to eat, to play, to make art, music, love, whatever was creative and productive. She and I soon became involved, and we enjoyed London together. Sometime that summer on the streets or in stores or studios, I would catch glimpses of the people who had already made it on the scene, the royals of swinging London going about their business. Twiggy, maybe, or Ray Davies, or Pete Townsend, or Rod Stewart, or Terence Stamp, or Marianne Faithfull, and I'd feel my dreams getting closer. Those feelings had a growing sense of reality, too. The music at Trident was very strong. My love, the blonde, was leaving no doubts at all about his potential. By the early summer of '69, David and I had begun to act as a team. I was the person to whom he played the tapes of his day's work in the studio, inviting reaction and comment. I was the one with whom he discussed philosophy, religion, history, society, and the doings of humanity around us, the raw material of his work. I got on the telephone for him and went with him to business meetings, both advising him and acting the heavy in the good cop, bad cop routine we were developing. More and more I became the person who put his ideas into action, found and secured the resources he needed, kicked down the doors he wanted to walk through. It was fun. I'd been educated, brought up, and perhaps even born for this role, and I relished it. Apart from loving, there's nothing I love more than being effective. Eventually there came a formalization of sorts, nothing legally or religiously sanctioned, but a commitment, fully binding in my heart, soul, and conscience. We were sitting together in the upstairs back room of his mother's house, shortly after his father died. It was the room where David had slept during his youth. I forget what hour of the day it was, and what led up to our discussion, but I remember the crux of the matter. I offered David a deal. He and I would stay together, I said, and embark on a joint course. First, we would work together to accomplish his goal, to make his dream of pop idolatry come true, to make him a star. And then we'd do the same for me. We would power me into a career on the stage and screen. David listened to me, then said, "Can you deal with the fact that I'm not in love with you?" I didn't even have to think about that. As far as I was concerned, David's version of being in love was what he'd had with Hermione, the girl he was with when I met him, sitting on a bed, holding hands for a year or two, suffocating each other emotionally, while the clock ticked and their careers went nowhere, and I wanted no part of that kind of love. I wanted us to make each other's worlds bigger, not smaller. I knew that David loved me in ways that really mattered. He needed me, respected me, and cared for me. And ultimately, as we both knew and had told each other more than once, we were kindred spirits. We were alike. We belonged together. So I told him, "Yes, David, I can deal with that. I can deal with anything." "All right then," he said, and agreed to my agenda. Freely, willingly, he accepted both my commitment to him and the trust I was placing in him. And so I'd taken my leap of faith. Right there in that little Bromley bedroom, looking out over the coal shed and up into the brilliance of a fine, free, star-bound future, I'd given David the best years of my life. When David and I were married, the only non-70s aspect of the affair was that neither of us was stoned when we said our words. I hate to call them vows, but we made up for that by proceeding straight from the registry office to the 3 Tons, our local pub, and getting as drunk as possible with our buddies. So, voila, one perfectly alternative wedding for one perfectly alternative couple. I must also say, however, that when David and I tied the knot, I did get a real old-fashioned girlish glow for a moment. The moment was sweet, significant, all those things, romantic. In fact, I really liked it. Yet I did my best to play these feelings down. It wouldn't be cool to start acting like a real girl all of a sudden. Better to stay strong, steady, competent, capable, motivated, aggressive, good and butch, in other words, the way David liked me. So much for romance. Now for convention. Oh, spare me! David, son of Lance, subscribed to the vision of monogamy shared by most males on the planet. Absolute fidelity until the first better offer, and moreover, he was an up-and-coming star in a world where better offers were abundant, if not actually overwhelming, on a more or less daily basis. So even if he had committed to a conventional monogamous marriage on pain of something genuinely threatening, say eternal banishment from the pop charts, I would have been a fool to accept. Besides, monogamy wouldn't have appealed to me in the first place. As long as we held true to each other and respected the love between us, then David and I were perfectly free to romp and dally with whoever else might tickle our fancy. We'd already made a good start in that direction. Our prenuptial night together with a gorgeous dark-haired actress friend of David's and Calvin's, Claire Shenstone, had been great fun. We went to her flat for dinner, got tipsy, fell into bed together, romped à trois until we all passed out, then woke late and rushed in a panic to the registry office. We were young and free, and this was London, ground zero for the bold and beautiful in a brave new world. Free love was natural, and simply what one did. It wasn't only the times, though. Or at least for me it wasn't. I'm hot on the subject partly, of course, because I'm bisexual, and I was traumatized and radicalized early in the game by the dire conclusion of my affair with Lorraine at Connecticut College. I'd felt the lash of the sexual bigot's whip, understood its power, and decided it needed fighting. Another root of my philosophy goes a little deeper and further into my childhood. Its fruit is a powerful disdain for the human vices of jealousy and possessiveness, low emotions, based in fear and imprisoning the spirit, the most profoundly destructive forces in relations between individuals, and the threads that bind the fabric of monogamous society. Not only do I disapprove of them, I abhor them. But sex wasn't the mainspring between David and me. In our partnership, the primary imperatives were creative expression, philosophical growth, and the achievement of our separate, mutual, and equally bright, burning ambitions. And in those domains we were very intimate, very trusting and cohesive, very intensely together. We sat together in Haddon Hall's blooming beauty, talking about Buddha and Confucius, Newton and Einstein, Kafka and Dali, all the great mysteries of history and creativity, struggling to align them and ourselves in our brave new world. We plotted and planned and dreamed and schemed. And of course we acted and we accomplished. We spent whole days and nights together. We touched a lot. We held hands. It was special. It was intense. We'd each found the person we needed to make our dreams come true. And that was a very powerful bond for people like us. We were almost embarrassingly grateful, almost maudlin about it. The two of us alone together against the world, kids claiming the future, dawn breaking on the house where we awoke and readied ourselves for the journey of our lives. To business then. Our first priorities were taken care of. Home base was secured and operational. Now we needed the rest of our stairway to stardom shopping list. Next item, one band. David had the foundation already. Tony Visconti on bass, John Cambridge on drums, himself on elementary rhythm guitar. But he didn't have the vital ingredient, the power and the glory of any real rock band, a lead guitarist. Hey, no problem, though. John Cambridge knew a very likely lad who might be open to offers. Mick Ronson was his name, and he was to be found far from the lights of swinging London, in the South Yorkshire industrial port of Hull. I have a very vivid memory of meeting Rono. What a lad! Hull's finest, leader of the Rats, the closest the city ever came to its own Beatles or even Jerry and the Pacemakers, a born and bred Mormon, an incorrigible ladies' man who was fast and loose, blonde, God handsome, oh Lord, how handsome, and one of the nicest, best-hearted men I have ever met. Dear Mick, how lucky we were to have coincided. A hot body filled the lead guitar slot then, and so the band was ready to begin competing seriously in the pop marketplace. By now, the major personnel requirements, including that of the roadie, had been met. Our roadie, Roger Fry, some kind of Australian Yorkshireman, or Yorkshire Australian, was a beauty. Wherever you've got a roadie, of course, you've also got a van, until, that is, you've got a truck, or a bus and a truck, or several trucks and buses, or an airplane, or an airplane and several trucks and buses, or several airplanes, trucks, and buses. It gets confusing. Roger, like Rono, was one of the balcony dwellers at Haddon Hall, and Haddon Hall was our new house, the stage set that I'd put together from where we were going to launch the play that made David Bowie a famous musical commodity. The balcony also served as more temporary bedding space for whomever we and the boys dragged home with us for purposes high or low, plus random guests too tired, stoned, drunk, or simply far from their own beds to make it home at night. That balcony was a great and significant asset then. Basically, it made it possible for David to have a band, which in turn made it possible for him to have a career in rock. I'm glad I didn't have to sleep up there, though. The people who did were usually startled out of sleep at some ghastly hour before the crack of dawn by me, barking orders or cajoling favors on the telephone in the hallway, right near the front door. That was my routine. While David slumbered happily in our bedroom, I'd get up and start doing business as soon as people arrived in their offices, or crank up the sewing machine and start turning out rock and roll finery, or begin whatever other task called most loudly for my attention. Haddon Hall, in short, introduced David to a brand new state of personal affairs. For the first time, he was in charge of his own life, and for that I take full credit. And yes, it was good to watch him begin acting more like a man and less like a boy. I liked David strong and responsible, the way he liked me. 1970 really was a good year. Our days were certainly goal-oriented, not at all aimless, but I wouldn't call them stressful. Fun is what I'd call them. Productive, optimistic, gregarious, challenging, pleasurable. I was feeling my oats that year, powering up, approaching thresholds. For one thing, I was spending time with Dana Gillespie and going places. She was the first person I'd known who had a fully formed philosophy of self-liberation, and she encouraged me. Dana helped me begin to see my own attractiveness. She brought out my femininity and challenged my conviction that my butch side was my only high card in life. I found a lot of new confidence in Dana. With David, I was also expanding. Our potential was becoming clearer, our horizons broadening, my hopes rising high. I remember one day in particular. We were sitting in a hip Soho coffee bar, and he was waxing lyrical about what fun it was when he was 16 doing black beauties and staying up for days on end, hanging out with his mod mates. Oh, yes, he was saying, that was rock and roll. That's what it was all about. I looked at him and thought, oh, no, my man. There's got to be more to rock and roll than that. It's got to go further. I don't want just the roar of the Benzedrine, the smell of the crowd, and some clammy little coffee bar to call home. I want the whole world. So David had a home, a door kicker, a band, and when we replaced Ken Pitt with Tony DeFries, he also had a manager he could handle. Now he needed something else. He needed to stand up and stand out. He needed to quit moving with the crowd. And consider the crowd. Put yourself in our shoes, among the crowd at a typical 1969-1970 rock concert in London, New York, San Francisco, a Kansas college town, wherever. For one thing, it smells. You have the basic grunge of the hall, which until recently may have been functioning as a XXX porn movie house, attracting odors closer to the dead fish than the fresh popcorn end of the spectrum, and inviting, most likely, a certain degree of flea infestation. Then, too, the promoter probably hasn't seen fit to have the bathrooms cleaned before the show, and there are other powerful scents competing with the basic grime and fetor. Incense may be burning, dope is very certainly on fire, grass and hash in joints and in pipes of every conceivable size, shape, and material. Oh, yes, another thing. The sticky floors, those swirls of evil black-brown goo and snaky ridgelets of crusty stuff under your precious all-organic tootsies in the dark, and you're having to handle this shit on drugs? I mean, bless us all. It was so much fun. But it really was sloppy. And not just the venues either. The shows themselves were, well, I guess loose is a good word. People stumbling around on stage, roadies bumping into drummers, bass players tripping over cables, pints of beer and gallons of wine sloshing all over the amplifiers, nobody ever getting it straight about which mics did what, lights fizzing out or flaring suddenly bright, PA systems either humming low and mean like alligators contemplating poodles, or belching apocalyptically when some tripped-out guitar god stuck his fender in the wrong hole. This stuff was routine, and more often than not, the whole crowd would have to experience at least a good half hour of it before the band even started tuning up, and that could be a marathon, too. When the first note hit, of course, the interminability of the wait was irrelevant. You were off, and I mean off, on whatever journey the band had in mind that night. But why did it have to be that way? Where was it written in the rock and roll Bible that a band had to be so incredibly untogether in every aspect of performance but the actual playing of their music? Why did they have to stand with their backs to the crowd? dress as if they had a date with a broken sump pump, intro their songs while tuning, of course, with gems like, we wrote this one, in New Mexico, and never even consider the idea that total electronic failure, at least once per show, usually more often, wasn't a preordained natural phenomenon. I couldn't stand that nonsense. Neither could David. We two would sit watching these guys stumbling around in the dark, tracked by spotlights that never seemed to catch them until they'd finished their solos, then wiping Coke snot on their blue jeans in beautifully illuminated view of thousands of their fans. And we would almost die of embarrassment and frustration. These guys didn't seem to care. But we wanted our act halfway together. At least we thought you could tune in a back room before you went on stage. You could set up your equipment behind a curtain, darken the house, raise the curtain, then hit the spotlights and stage lights and boom, make your appearance. That's where the first note belonged, for pity's sake. Notions modest enough, those, but they were the start of modern rock staging and showmanship, and the seed of David's great difference, and the beginning of glitter. In that matter of image, or more accurately presentation, we had to begin with the most basic unit, David's body. My gorgeous lad didn't have a personal hygiene problem, exactly, but you could never describe him as immaculate or crisp, or even fresh. He was in the habit of bathing only every 3 or 4 days, so he often appeared a little off, wilted. Moldy is the word that springs most forcefully to mind. Well, that just wouldn't do. No way. I didn't nag him about it, or diplomatically suggest more frequent tubbing, or even confront him in a forthright but caring manner. I simply drew a bath for him every morning and took him by the hand and led him to it, which was fine with him. David loved being taken care of. Bit by bit, Haddon Hall came up in the world. Yes, high style, getting higher, a salon of distinction, a setting fit for a star. A star needs a firmament, though. A great salon needs great characters, flamboyant personalities, sparkling guests. A fashion leader needs followers. A spokesman needs people to speak for. David's case called for all these elements. The wonderful thing is that he found them all in one place. The Sombrero Club it was. This red-hot basement dance club on Kensington High Street, a disco, not a live band place, catered to people who worked in the fashion industry. It was visual, dance-oriented, and gay. David loved it, and so did I. It had a sizzle to it. The music was all hard-moving American R&B, and the people were up there with the music. High energy was the theme, sex the undercurrent, speed the drug of choice. One item belongs chronologically with the first few months of our sombrero period, but it demands its own treatment. We were pregnant. I had conceived one morning at Haddon Hall in late August 1970. I remember having no doubt about what had just happened, and on May 30th, 1971, I gave birth to Duncan Zoe Haywood Bowie, a healthy 8.5-pound boy at Bromley Hospital. It was the natural thing to do. My mother's influence, my Catholic upbringing, and the earth-mothering ethos of the times conspired with something purely personal to persuade me that I was ripe for early motherhood. To have a child, I thought, was to follow the biological function of my body, and great benefits would result from such alignment with the natural order. These things were cooking around in my head when I first broached the subject to David. You're always playing with other people's kids, you know. Maybe we should have a child. But the oldest motivation in the book was perhaps also an ingredient. Perhaps I could feel a distance growing between us, and thought parenthood would bring us closer together. I don't know. It sounds a bit like the wisdom of hindsight, but it has a ring to it. David's reaction was interesting. Yeah, but you're so busy, having a child, that's a lot of work. It was okay, though. I reassured him. I reminded him that such things as nannies existed in this world. The entire ruling class of his country had been raised by them, for God's sakes. And so we decided to have a baby. I quit taking the pill and left the rest to nature. And sure enough, nature came through. The bare facts are that I was in labor for 30 hours, fully conscious, until I finally managed to squeeze my 8.5-pound boy out between my very narrow hips, cracking my pelvis in the process. I ended up in real trouble, physically torn and broken, ravaged emotionally by withdrawal from the painkillers and the guilt of having not coped better with the whole experience. Isolated in my suffering as everyone around me rejoiced and goo-gooed over the new baby, and more than anything, utterly exhausted. I was strained and beaten half to death, heading blindly and helplessly down the age-old female path into chronic postpartum depression. I survived the first 2 weeks somehow, and finally could get out of bed and walk around the house without half killing myself physically. But emotionally I was getting worse rather than better, feeling more depressed, more guilty, and more isolated. And nobody, not David, certainly not his mother, who would show up now and then just to give the knife a twist, seemed to care. Donna Gillespie did, though. The first time she laid eyes on me after the birth, she barely paused to express her shock. God, Angie, you're as white as a sheet. You look like death. Before coming up with a typically healthy, straightforward solution. You need sunshine, girl. She was planning a brief vacation at her father's villa on Lago Maggiore in Italy, and she was unequivocal about it. She wouldn't even think of going without me. She was right. I had to go. Those 5 or 6 days gave me enough sanity to go back to Haddon Hall and handle it. They were my salvation. They may, however, have been the opposite for my marriage. David, I think, was appalled by what I'd done, horrified that I could get up and leave my baby boy the way I had, gadding off, to his way of thinking, for fun in the sun with my friend. He didn't express that, of course. Honesty of that kind wasn't within his emotional range. Perhaps he arched an eyebrow when I first told him I wanted to go, but I can't vouch that he even did that. He raised no objections, going along with everything I did to ensure Zoe's welfare while I was away, and as far as I knew, accepting my decision and understanding its urgent necessity. That was just his front, though. Beneath it, that good old non-confrontational, passive-aggressive machine was engaging gears, activating its clandestine weaponry, and going to work on our love. Why? Well, I believe it came from the most common and powerful source of sickness in a man's relationship with a wife, his relationship with his mother. For David, I think my flight conjured up images, not just images, but memories of his mother's rejecting and abandoning his half-brother. So right there, somewhere, during or just before or after my few days in Lago Maggiore, he scared himself into seeing me through the veil of distrust and resentment, originally designed for Peggy Burns. And in some ways, that was that. The beginning of the end of it all between him and me. I had gained a son, but I'd begun the process of losing a husband. Life goes on. We had oodles and oodles of distractions. This was a very intense time in David's career, the period in which we did the work that would make him a star. A great deal of David's inspiration came from the United States. You can say that about many 20th century popular artists around the world, of course. What I mean is that David picked up all kinds of tricks, techniques, and attitudes when he went to the States, and when they came to him. He returned from a radio tour in February 1971 with the usual English boy's mix of arrogance and wonder. Ugh, the commercialism, the corruption, the crudity, the crime, the lack of control. Oh my, the speed, the size, the food, the riches, the freedom. And there were more individual impressions, too. His antennae had been extended to their fullest in the cutting-edge circles to which he was introduced in New York and Hollywood, and he'd homed in directly on the most happening of happening themes in American pop culture, which at the time meant one simple name, Warhol. Andy, as pop culturists will no doubt be explaining for the next couple of centuries, had managed in 1971 to position himself in the center of a giant spiderweb of avant allure and multi-sexual chic, from which he fed on the most adventurous young things the USA had to offer him. Personally, I have my problems with Warhol mystique. I'm not, never was, impressed. But I can't deny its power, and only a fool would argue that it didn't greatly benefit David's cause, and therefore mine. In England in 1971, for instance, there was a very powerful curiosity about Warhol, and anything and anybody in any way connected with his scene. Factory unfilmmakers and unfilmed stars such as Paul Morrissey, Viva, and Ultraviolet. Musicians such as Lou Reed and John Cale in New York, and Iggy Pop emerging from Detroit. David, with his usual ultra-keen eye for a hot-breaking trend, worked very consciously to link himself with that demand. He made sure to mention Iggy and Lou and anyone else he thought might do him some good in every interview he gave at the time. And I'm sure it worked. Both British and American tastemakers attuned to the trend frequencies soon got the idea that David Bowie was a close cultural ally of the Warhol axis. And of course, the way the media work, if you say something that sounds good, it becomes true, as Andy knew, preached, and demonstrated. And that's what happened with David and the Warhol gang. A few months later, Tony Zanetta arranged for us to meet Andy. It was at the factory during our trip to New York for the signing of David's new recording contract with RCA. I remember a space done in aluminum foil, a bunch of incredibly pale people lounging around in various states approaching coma, squeezing out the occasional nihilistic statement or existentialist non sequitur or meaningless triviality. I remember nobody paying even the slightest attention to me. I might as well have been wood or non-reflective wallpaper, and I recall many moments of silent, relatively acute social discomfort before David took the initiative and played a tape of his new song, Andy Warhol, to its subject. That broke the silence, but only temporarily. Andy got up and left the room without a word after the last note. There was some doubt, unexpressed, of course, as to whether or not that signaled the end of our encounter. But Andy returned after a few minutes, said, "That was great, thank you," in that little wind-up toy faggot voice of his, and then applied himself in silence to the task of taking Polaroids of David, peeling them off one by one, and laying them out before him on a coffee table. I have no idea how it all might have ended had things gone on the way they were going. Suddenly it all changed. Andy noticed David's shoes, bright yellow patent leather, as I recall, one of my image-enhancing fashion finds, and evidently that spurred a sequence of neurological reactions, resulting in, of all things, volubility. At once he became just as chatty as could be. David pegged it for me later. Before he'd become the Campbell soup can man, Andy had been a shoe designer, so we'd been able to come up with something that interested him. Now, wasn't that lucky, and weren't we blessed? So David had a new contract with RCA, and Tony DeFries, the bright spark who replaced Ken Pitt as David's manager, had secured complete creative control for David as well as lots more money. So David was happy, and I was happy that he was happy. RCA was treating us like stars, throwing parties for us, and limoing us around the hot spots. We met Lou Reed and Iggy Pop at one party and saw Elvis perform at Madison Square Garden. And that stuff was just wonderful. It's so nice when they bend over and smooch your tootsies like that, especially the first time round. When we walked into our room at the Plaza, an impressive enough experience itself, and saw what the record company people had done for us, it half killed me with kindness. Piled on the bed and all around it were wrapped presents, all David's RCA promotional material, the whole RCA album catalog for that year, plus the entire Elvis catalog, and personal welcome aboard and welcome to New York gifts from all sorts of people in the music business. It was bigger and better than any Christmas I'd ever had, and all the more wonderful because it was so unexpected. David and I looked at each other like little kids and grinned all over. "This is it, isn't it?" he said. I looked around me, drinking it all in, experiencing the same delightful impression as my man's. "Yeah, babe, I think you're right. It's happened." And by God it had. If they treat you like a star, it means you are one. So we'd done it. We'd arrived. Apart from a good number of great rock records, my ex-husband gave two pretty significant gifts to the world we've known these past 20 years. He very publicly asked a question our generation was very obviously begging. Well, what sex are we? And he almost single-handedly initiated some 2 decades worth of dress sense and hairstyle. David's new hairstyle triggered new experiments with makeup and greater interest in clothes, and it wasn't long at all before young David Jones had transformed himself into a figure that was pure 100% head-to-toe Ziggy Stardust. A lithe, red-headed, face-painted, very revealingly and very originally clothed, polysexual Stardust alien. Which, of course, did the trick, image-wise. There would never again be any doubt about which one David Bowie was, even if who he was immediately became a mystery that has persisted to this day. By creating Ziggy to go out and front for him, David never had to act like himself in public if he didn't want to, which in turn meant that he could pursue art and applause without having to deal with his lack of self-esteem, as the shrinks put it, or more accurately, his frigid self-loathing. And, of course, as the cultural historians have noted, David as Ziggy was one of the great social catalysts of the times. He was the flash that ignited a worldwide explosion of sex role experimentation, glitter competition, and narcissistic self-absorption. And as Ziggy began his conquest of the world's imagination, it became clear to me that, fortunately, I'd done my end of the job quite well. The team I'd marshaled was talented, spirited, and remarkably effective. David now had behind him a very fine, full-fledged rock band, a marvelously cunning manager, a greatly gifted personal designer, a creative and dedicated stylist and wardrobe mistress, a hell-on-wheels wife to run everyone for him, and a full-time nanny to make it possible for her to do so. Ziggy was ready to rock and roll. It's true that a single picture can make a deeper impression than words beyond number. But it's also true that a few of the right words in the right place at the right time can move more mountains than images ever could. Such was the case with one section of an interview with David, published on January 22nd, 1972, in Melody Maker. The words were brief and simple. "I'm gay. I always have been, even when I was David Jones." But their effect was enormous. I had no qualms whatsoever about reassuring him to the fullest possible degree. I was so thrilled, in fact, that I hooted. I could hardly contain myself. "David, do you realize what you've done? You fucking made it. There's going to be no stopping us now, babe." He relaxed a little and explained that until the very moment he said it, he hadn't known he was going to. He hadn't made up his mind one way or the other, even after all the talking he and I had done, all the sex liberation philosophy and politics I'd been gently pushing on him. "You did the right thing, babe. You really did," I told him. "Wait and see. It was the right thing to do and the right time to do it. Marketing-wise, it was just perfect." It was the simple printed admission that hooked the Fleet Street reporters, and they really went to town on it. It was wonderful. In those late January days, I would pick up the newspapers and just giggle, loving every legend-building word. I could just feel all those kids out there perking up and taking notice, all those mums and dads sitting around the kitchen fire, scratching their heads and wondering, "Gay, he said he had a fairy, married, wears a dress, got a kid." In the depth of the winter of 1972, Ziggy and the Spiders went out into the world for the first time and conquered it. It was wonderful, that first UK tour. It wasn't a sellout all the way, though. In some of the cities, the halls were only half full. But everywhere David and the boys went, the reaction was delirious. I went to 4 or 5 of the gigs myself, and I'll never forget them, particularly the moment when I found myself in a box at the Queen's Playhouse in Glasgow, watching with my heart in my mouth as the fans started climbing up the walls of the theater to get to me in the balcony. My mother was with me, and to this day I don't know who was more amazed, scared, and delighted all at once, she or I. When the show returned to London and played the Imperial College, I remember the crowd rushed the stage during David's encore and carried him out of the hall in triumph on their shoulders, like some great hero of ancient Rome. It was wild. Wonder and delirium from city to city to city. It might have been the costumes that did it. David changed his 3 times each show, or the spectacular sound system, a setup we'd ensured was far superior to prevailing industry standards, or perhaps the strobes that kept flashing until the whole crowd was tripped out crazy. All those staging elements were new to the rock arena. But then, so was Ziggy Stardust, and so were the wonderful Ziggy songs, and so was David, in all his charismatic glory. After trying for so long, he was finally claiming his place, center stage. I loved those first months of David's stardom, and so did he, and so did everyone else in our little troupe of players. We felt fine, famous, and fully appreciated. We felt extra special, intensely alive, incredibly alert. We felt like successful grown-ups, but also like boys and girls at play, which is the great gift of the performer's life. We felt like friends, and we felt like a family. It was beautiful, it really was. When we finally got a break, what did we do? We rented a villa in Rome and we all went on holiday together. We loved each other. It didn't even occur to us to go our separate ways. Communality and creativity, no matter how happily intense, did not necessarily banish cold calculation. Or at least in the case of David Bowie in 1972, they didn't. This isn't really surprising. I don't think David has ever known how to get really carried away, except, of course, by booze and drugs. Take, for instance, his approach to Lou Reed, who made his first British appearance as a guest on David's stage. David, you see, was very smart. The only really serious competition in his market niche, he concluded, consisted of Lou Reed and maybe Iggy Pop. So what did David do? He co-opted them. He brought them into his circle. He talked them up in interviews, spreading their legend in Britain, and then he personally chaperoned their introduction to British audiences. Everybody made out pretty well in all this action, and everybody ended up beholden to David Bowie in one way or another. That was some smooth operating, I thought, admiring David's moves and helping out with counsel and logistics support. The fact that I didn't fool around much during the cyclone of David's early stardom doesn't mean I was any kind of good girl or conventional wife. Hell no. I didn't fool around much, but I did fool around. One fun little fling was my happy dalliance with Anton Jones on David's first U.S. tour, which began late in the fall of 1972. Anton, a tall, athletic, witty, talented, gorgeously green-eyed Jamaican, had first joined our troupe as the chef on a Roman holiday. Now he was traveling with us across North America as a bodyguard. He was a wonderful man, and for me he was far and away the high point of the tour. Not that he had much competition. We weren't exactly seeing America from superstar level yet. We traveled by bus, not a modern Silver Eagle with beds and everything, but some ordinary chartered bus, and stayed at Marriott's and Sheraton's. We played a lot of halls where the sound echoed around an awful lot of empty seats. I remember that a whole batch of West Coast dates were canceled, and that in Florida, Ronno's hair turned green from the chlorine in the pool as we sat waiting for news of the next date and living on room service because there wasn't any cash. David was occupied most of the time. He was in constant conference and/or coitus with a shifting parade of somebodies or other, local record company, promo men, disc jockeys, promoters, press people, and groupies. We were more like partners in a very busy business than like man and wife. We didn't even share a room most of the time, as I recall, and actually it would have been awkward if we had. Threesomes and foursomes and other varieties of multi-party sex are of course very fine in their place, but David's coital conferencing was more a motivational maneuver than a recreational act, and best performed one-on-one. Thank God for Anton, then. He was a great distraction. We'd fool around together on the bus and bounce around together in the motels and generally just enjoy each other in every way. That should have been fine with David, according to the stated terms between us. But I guess it wasn't. The crunch came one night in Memphis or Louisville or somewhere else southern, when, seeking escape from a broiling, humid motel room, Anton and I went swimming in the motel pool. As far as we were concerned, we were perfectly right and proper. The pool was lit, and it wasn't even midnight yet. Motel management didn't see it that way, though. We were splashing happily, laughing and whooping, and having tons of naughty fun. Who knows who had what in whose mouth, when all of a sudden, it seemed we had every uptight redneck desk clerk in the South Central United States in our face. Those people were seriously annoyed. They ordered us out of the pool immediately. They were shrieking and proceeded to scold us as if we were delinquent 5-year-olds. Anton made the error of talking back to them, too, and that made them even crazier. Some great big bold Mandingo warrior with a weird foreign accent, taking an attitude like he thought they were the subhumans, and he might just stop their clocks if they didn't start acting right. You could feel their lynching fingers twitching. David saved the day for once. He showed up in the lobby and charmed things down very efficiently and saved Anton, but he didn't save me. He got rid of me as quickly as he could, in fact, setting in motion events that very rapidly produced plane tickets and sayonaras. I was on my way to New York the next day and back to London very soon after that. The effect was lasting. From that point on, I was never invited along on tour. I'd go on the road for brief periods now and then, either when I insisted or when David grew lonely or felt that he needed my mothering or door-kicking services. But usually those times would end just the way my first tour ended. I'd start having too much fun. David would start feeling threatened, and home I'd go. So far as my being a core member of the traveling troupe, that was it. I was banished. In a way, it was okay with me. Touring is a hassle. Far too much like hard work, with too many of the stresses of normal travel and none of the benefits. Nobody but a born gypsy or a person running from something really likes it. In other ways, though, my banishment wasn't good at all. I had already lost some of my intimacy with David by working myself out of a job, by finding and hiring Tony DeFries, by hiring others to take care of roles I'd once performed. And now I was losing contact and influence in yet another area of his life. Furthermore, I had the distinct feeling that that was fine with him, and even finer with Tony DeFries. I was a little paranoid about that, but then I realized it was appropriate for me to be disengaging from David's career. The energy I had been pouring into him needed to go elsewhere now. Now, you see, it was my turn. Together we had made David a star, T.S. Eliot with a rock and roll beat, no less, and now, according to the pact that we had made that turning point day in his mother's upstairs back bedroom, we would do the same for me. With the resources now at our disposal, I thought, hey, it shouldn't be hard at all. In a way, it was okay with me. Touring is a hassle. Far too much like hard work, with too many of the stresses of normal travel and none of the benefits. Nobody but a born gypsy or a person running from something really likes it. In other ways, though, my banishment wasn't good at all. I had already lost some of my intimacy with David by working myself out of a job, by finding and hiring Tony DeFries, by hiring others to take care of roles I'd once performed. And now I was losing contact and influence in yet another area of his life. Furthermore, I had the distinct feeling that that was fine with him, and even finer with Tony DeFries. I was a little paranoid about that, but then I realized it was appropriate for me to be disengaging from David's career. The energy I had been pouring into him needed to go elsewhere now. Now, you see, it was my turn. Together we had made David a star, T.S. Eliot with a rock and roll beat, no less, and now, according to the pact that we had made that turning point day in his mother's upstairs back bedroom, we would do the same for me. With the resources now at our disposal, I thought, hey, it shouldn't be hard at all. I may have wanted my own career, but that didn't mean I was free to pursue it. David and Tony may have been edging me out of the center of things, but that didn't mean I was free to disengage from David's business. Those boys kept me pretty busy. And not that I disliked the work. For one thing, it had become almost second nature for me to promote and protect David and the ideas he stood for. My role had its own great internal momentum. For another, the job very definitely had its moments. I mean, really. If you had to work for anyone but yourself between 1972 and 1974, could you have done any better than David Bowie? He was where the action was, and some of the action was so much fun. In April 1973, for example, I had a wonderful working vacation in Japan, an utterly fascinating place, and the home of many a dedicated David Bowie fan. Something about David, perhaps his almost formal mime and dance-based approach to theatricality, struck a powerful chord in those ancient cultured islanders. The more contemporary Japanese cultural consciousness took to the strange new English glitter critter as if he'd popped up out of some fiery anomaly only miles off the wharves of Nagasaki. The audiences there, for instance, were incredible. Young and fresh and almost childlike in their exuberance, worlds away from the older, infinitely less innocent crowds David was drawing in Europe and the United States. They gave us so much. Their sheer happiness when David appeared before them was wonderful. A cocoon of wonder and pleasure came down around us. David and I hadn't made love together in months, but we did in Japan several times. We felt like a family, too. Having Zoe with us on tour was a first-time experience, and it gave a new flavor to the scene. When we traveled on the bullet train to Hiroshima, Zoe went roaming around the car as 2-year-olds will, and the other passengers were so sweet to him. By the time the train ride was over, the Japanese, they're unbelievable with children. He was friends with everybody. One woman picked him up and sat him on her knee and started feeding him with her chopsticks. He was delighted, and she smiled at us so tenderly that tears almost welled up in my eyes. When I saw David's face shining with pride and love for his child, they did. David could be so kind, so gentle. I loved him so much, I really did. He was at his very best on that Japanese tour. Creative, vital, stimulated by his work and his surroundings, and happy and comfortable among the people who loved him. It was another of those moments, with my husband and son beside me in harmony. All the discord of the recent past faded away, and I felt more strongly than ever that I was doing the right thing. We were moving forward on our destined path, and we were going to be all right. Aladdin Sane, the new set of songs and new characters to sing them that David had created while on tour in the States, was released in Britain while we were still in Japan. Advance orders exceeded 100,000 units. This had not happened since the heyday of the Beatles, and the album went gold on the day it was released. While David and the boys and girls of our troupe went zooming off on a triumphant, sold-out British tour in the spring and early summer of 1973, I zoomed around London taking care of business in a state of positivity and enthusiasm. As the final dates of the tour approached, David called to talk about a party to cap it all off. What I didn't know, what nobody knew except David and Tony DeFries, was what the theme of the party was going to be. That is, what David was going to say from the stage of the Odeon at the end of the July 3rd concert. And that, and I quote, was, "Not only is this the last show of the tour, but it is the last show we'll ever do. Bye-bye, we love you." I was surprised, of course, but I wasn't exactly stunned or moved to any particular extreme of emotion. No way in hell would David retire, so I hardly gave it another thought. Until, that is, I spoke to Ronno and Trevor backstage and learned that they and Woody had been completely surprised by David's announcement and were beginning to grasp its implications. As Trevor put it, "We're out of a job, Angie. He's given us the fucking sack." What is freaky, chilling, is the fact that he kept them on through the Japanese tour, then through the British tour, without even hinting at his decision, and only then, once they'd given him their best and were enjoying their most triumphant moment, did he let them have it, full bore, all at once, in the most public, humiliating manner possible. That's what you could call exceptionally cool, intelligent self-interest. But you'd be a lot closer to the truth, I think, if you called it ruthlessness, cowardice, and cruelty. I continued to be useful as Mr. Big Shot got bigger. I was, after all, very good at care and attention. I did get done what needed doing. For instance, I was assigned to take the Stooges to Ann Arbor, Michigan, where they, the MC5, and many other practitioners of raw, heavy, doped-out, radical, pre-punk metal rock had made themselves a home. I had myself an interesting time, too. I got close to James Williamson, the lead guitarist, and Ron Ashton, the bass player. My time in Ann Arbor was my first intimate experience with users of heavy drugs, and I didn't really like it much. For one thing, users can't be very spontaneous. When you say, "I've got an idea, let's go to Paris for the weekend," the first thing that comes into their minds is, "Oh, shit, I don't have a French connection." I think that's the big reason the Stooges weren't too upset about being sent back to Ann Arbor. Home was where the best drugs were. I didn't get into either coke or smack as it happened. I'd rather fight to the death than stick a needle in my arm, and my first experience of snorting cocaine was nearly my last. Just like Woody Allen and Annie Hall, I was the idiot who took her first snort and proceeded to sneeze the little white lines all over the carpet. Cocaine in 1973 was very elite and reputedly harmless. A happy time, non-addictive, very hip, superior lift. In the trendiest circles, its conspicuous consumption was becoming virtually de rigueur. Only pedestrians, it seemed, didn't do it, or worse yet, still smoked pot. Personally, I hated the stuff right from the start. It was far too close to home. The third quarter of 1973, you see, is when David and cocaine began to work on a serious relationship. Before we approach the sorry saga of David's drug addiction, though, I should map out the lay of the land between David and me regarding boyfriends, girlfriends, and boy-girlfriends during this period. It was simple. I wanted what David was getting, so I went and got it, sometimes literally. As time went on, I made a point of seducing David's sex mates myself, ideally before he'd bedded them. It was never hard to mark them. I knew his type, and I could see the charm-your-pants-off light in his eyes when he turned toward a likely prospect. I was interested, of course, only in the most talented and significant people. David's parade of groupies and business lubes didn't interest me at all. My attitude was that while they might be the ones doing the bunny with the great Bowie, I was the wife. I had the rank and the privileges. And yes, I did let that be known. When I came into the room, you'd better jump up and salute, girl, and then get back down on your knees or back or stomach. Otherwise, your big day would start going wrong rather quickly. Usually it all worked out fine. Sometimes it got a little difficult, discussing rock and roll logistics with your husband while some star-struck little West Berlin hermaphrodite or round-heeled New York publicist was stripping his chrome. Most of the time, though, we could conclude our business with reasonable success. Amusing? Yeah, but David hurt me. He began breaking our unspoken rules. He began making his conquests and maintaining his mistresses close to home, in my circle, in my face. He started sleeping with a big, beautiful black woman who was my friend. He imported Ava Cherry, a blonde, black singer he'd met in Chicago, and set her up in an apartment right around the corner from my house. Those pieces of business left me feeling, what's the word? Unloved, I guess. The question was, what exactly did David want from me? That is, from our marriage. He didn't want things between us the way I wanted them, obviously enough. Creatively and professionally co-equal, sexually and emotionally free, but intimate and trusting with each other. So what did he want? Did he want things as they were, distant sexually, close emotionally and creatively only when he needed my services? Or did he want them warmer, with me under his wing in a much more conventionally male chauvinistic model of marriage? Did he want the basic good old-fashioned English rock and roll star marriage in which hubby lances his way around the globe, free as an eagle, while wifey stays happily home, studying macrobiotics and raising babies? Or did he simply want me out of his hair? The answer to these questions, I regret to say, is, how the hell would I know? For one thing, David was unapproachable on the clear, direct level where the all-important nitty-gritty like this can be discussed. He was incapable of telling me what he wanted. It probably never even occurred to him that he could. Sad to say, but true. He probably didn't have an honest bone in his whole emotional body. And I played right into a setup like that. My job in our relationship was to be the interpreter and effectuator of his unspoken desires. I was tuned to figure out what he wanted and to do it. I was not tuned to come right out and ask, or not to give a damn one way or the other about whatever he so secretly wanted. David didn't and wouldn't tell me what he wanted of me, no matter how deviously I might try to get him to make it clear. None of it really mattered anyway, though, because he was getting deeper and deeper into cocaine, the great leveler of absolutely everything. Trying to have a relationship with a coke freak is like trying to eat an aircraft carrier. And me? Well, for me it was a fog, a murk, a dance in the dark. I wanted him back. I wanted him to leave me alone. I knew what was happening. I believed it really wasn't. I cared too much to let myself think about it. I was having too good a time to give a damn. Oh, take your pick. It's all true. Our spacious new house in Chelsea was a great house for a party. And it had to be, because Chelsea in 1974 was one of those places at one of those times. Chelsea was where people grouped and mingled and partied. The pop arts were at the peak of their power. The money was still there. The vibe was confident. The good times felt permanent. You could say, looking back, that collectively we were just about to hit the crest of the pop energy wave, first set in motion by the Beatles a decade before. Soon the wave would break, and we'd be foundering or even drowning in punk, coke, smack, disco, decadence, disillusion, degradation, mass unemployment, urban warfare, and all the other consequences of bloody Margaret Thatcher's eat the poor governance. But right then and there, around the streets of Chelsea in '74, it felt as if our party would just go on getting bigger, richer, sweeter, and wilder forever. The situation with money, however, was ridiculous. When we needed cash for non-chargeable expenses, it was a bloody nightmare. It wore on David as well as me. He'd started hanging out with Mick Jagger, for one thing, and he didn't like the disparity between their lifestyles. Mick seems to own half the bloody world, and I don't own anything, he'd say. I go to Tony, and he just keeps telling me I'm not making enough to pay back RCA. My record sales just aren't big enough, but there's certainly enough bloody money for his house and his lemos and all his stuff, isn't there? David's sole source of the spend fest didn't get it. I dunno, baby, tell me. It sure seems to me that I'm making it. What's happening? Were all those people getting into all those concerts for nothing? I can't fucking stand it. Where's my money? Well, darling, I don't know, I'd reply sweetly. Maybe you should ask Mick how he operates. You know, get some tips. He's a pretty good businessman, I think. Maybe there are better ways of doing things than the way you're doing them. That, of course, was something of an understatement. The average performing flea had a more advantageous arrangement with its trainer than David had with big-nosed Tony DeFries. Tony's approach to David, which emulated that of his hero, Colonel Tom Parker, to poor Elvis, had resulted in his being personally entitled to 50% of all the income generated by David and being in operational control of the whole amount, David's cash included. I'm not kidding. David had actually bought that deal, signed on the bottom line. It must have been the cocaine, I think. When you're into cocaine, you don't want to endure friends, family, festive dinner parties, wonderful meals, those kinds of things. Nah, you want to get together with another cocaine addict, or 2 or 3, and do cocaine. Talk your heads off, stay up forever, obsess yourselves crazy. David's whole way of life changed then. Everything from his daily schedule to his choice of companions. He started living largely in the dark, in the company of other coke freaks. He visited home only when he needed to or could be assured that his nearest and dearest or other non-cocaine people wouldn't bother him. I saw less and less of him, and I just hated that. I couldn't stand watching the David I knew vanishing from his own life, and I couldn't believe there was nothing I could do to bring him back. There was room in that fog of feelings for some sharp contrasts, and so I fought for myself as well as beating myself up. In my own way, I survived, took what I needed, and even hit back. My ego demanded it. David needed to know that he wasn't the only tomcat in the Bowie family, and I needed to know that I wasn't missing out on the goodies. And oh my, I surely wasn't. Roy Martin was his name. I'd seen him once at Dana's place, but I first connected with him one late night at a club called Tramps. He was sitting with Mick Taylor, the Stones' lead guitarist at the time, and Mick's wife, Rose, and I noticed him immediately. Lush, dark hair, wonderful turquoise eyes, and a lean, muscular, aquiline face, great strength and sensitivity there, and not a little danger, too. Roy was a challenge, as I found out the first time he and I tried out his huge Victorian bed. We were relaxing afterwards, and I was thinking we'd just had a wonderful time, but evidently he wasn't. "How old are you?" he asked. I was taken aback a touch, but I answered him. "I'm 25, I said. "Well, what a shame," he said. "So young, and just look at you. No muscle tone, no stamina. You've let yourself go to hell, haven't you? You've got the body structure of an athlete and a dancer, but you're a mess. Do you ever get any exercise?" I couldn't believe it. Who the hell did he think he was? How can you talk to me like that when we've just made love? I was really hurt and angry. "You call that making love?" he laughed. "Well, Angie, if you really think that is what sex is about, all I can say is, you've got a lot to learn." I stared at him, speechless. Then I found my voice and started mumbling something about what gave him the right. He cut me short. "Look, I'll tell you what gives me the right, and I'm never going to say this again, okay? I'm falling in love with you." "What did you say?" "I'm falling in love with you." "Oh, okay." And it was okay. I was still smarting from the critique of my lovemaking, but a position stated as clearly as the one Roy had just delivered made up for a lot, as did his promise to teach me what I needed to know. I had every confidence that he could come through on that promise, too. He was 10 years older than I, but he was in infinitely better shape, much stronger and suppler, with much more stamina and control, and he was a wonderful, wonderful lover. I'd never experienced anyone like him. He and I started a sexual relationship that would last 3 full years, and from the very beginning he taught me so much. I learned that I couldn't be physically tuned if I lived on red meat and sugar and all that other crap, and that if I exercised properly, my body both felt better and performed better. I learned how to deepen my pleasure in many ways, how to smoke a joint for maximum effect, how to eat sensually, and of course, how to really make love. I learned how to let myself go all the way, into orgasms the likes of which I'd never even dreamed. I learned how to prolong my pleasure almost indefinitely, and how to do the same for my partner. I learned about vibrators and other tools and games and fantasies. I learned how to get tied up and enjoy being restrained long enough to come. I learned that I could really act out the scripts running in my sexual imagination. Together, Roy and I dismantled my inhibitions, one by one. He certainly had his uses, that man. As well as everything else, it was he who introduced me to the idea that material possessions are transitory and unimportant, that it's how you feel, not what you've got, that matters. It was also he who actually put me back on the stage. He didn't talk about it. He took action. Roy said simply, "You're an actress, and there's room for you, so you should do it." He coached me and helped me, giving me his craft and passing along his experience freely. At this time, David was mostly absent. He was elsewhere most of the time, playing with Mick Jagger or working on his Diamond Dogs album. In April of 1974, he boarded the SS France. David wouldn't fly. He'd had premonitions and steamed away to take up residence in New York. That, he told me, was where the action was. I couldn't argue about that, even if the idea of anyone's actually volunteering to live in an environment as savage as New York baffled me. But the city was, plainly, taking over London's luster as the action center of the world's music business. And just as obviously, it was where David's money was being spent, so you could make a good case for the proposition that he belonged there. The real clincher, however, wasn't any of that, or even other surefire Gotham selling points like Broadway, 24-hour nightlife, and cockroaches capable of surviving 30-kiloton thermonuclear explosions 2 feet away and still finding your eyelids in the middle of the night. No, for David, none of these mattered, and neither did New York's real, no-kidding appeal, whatever it might be. For him, the deal was simple: cocaine. It just so happened that for David Bowie at that particular moment in history, the best, most consistently and easily available cocaine was in Manhattan, supplied by a new friend and even more frequent companion, the wealthy art dealer Norman Fisher. The Norman connection was so superior to any other, in fact, that there simply wasn't any question about where David belonged. He rented what had been the Italian ambassador's suite at the Sherry Netherland Hotel on Fifth Avenue opposite Central Park, and his new life began. He met my new beau before he left, and liked him a great deal. The affection was mutual. Roy thought a lot of David, enjoyed his company, and respected his position as my husband. The two became friends, in fact. I liked that, and so did David. "I feel better about leaving you here now I know you're with Roy," he said. "I think Roy could take good care of you when I'm not around. I trust him." I liked that, too. I felt good, less abandoned, more considered and cared for. David's trust in Roy seemed at the time an entirely benevolent phenomenon. And maybe it was. Maybe it was. Having earlier raised the subject of David and Mr. Michael Philip Jagger, our Chelsea neighbor, it would be remiss of me to overlook it without further ado. Mick had been significant in David's story, after all, and you could certainly say that he's touched mine, too. First, let me make it plain. I like Mick, and in certain ways even admire him. I appreciate it, for instance, that you'll never find him following the script acted out by far too many of the yabos who become the English rock royalty. No, Mick may be rich, but he's not idle. Whenever he sits down for a 3-hour lunch at San Lorenzo, he's talking tours, films, venues, or deals of one sort or another, and he never picks up the bill. I like that. Mick is also extremely witty, with that frank, fast London earthiness, and he's open and natural, very worldly, not at all impressed by anyone else's conceit, and certainly not stuck up himself. A very intelligent and charming human being altogether, and great fun. I must admit, too, that I'm in awe of him as a business mind and a manager. He's kept the Stones more or less together and solvent for some 30 years. Amazing when you think about it. Brian Jones died and Mick Taylor left, but those are the only personnel changes the Stones have had since they started recording. It's incredible. That's like keeping the Flying Wallendas on top without having new generations come into the act. It's like doing what Frank Sinatra has done, but with 5 egos instead of 1. Mick's the ultimate team player. He knows what Charlie Watts wants and what Bill Wyman wants, and he knows that if he makes sure they get it, he'll get what he wants, which is for the industry called the Rolling Stones to keep producing whatever he needs. And of course, I love Mick and Keith's music and their whole thing. I'm a Stones fan, not a Beatles fan. The Stones always seemed far more dangerous, therefore infinitely more interesting. On the whole, the Stones are very nice guys, give or take a little kink or two. Bill Wyman, for instance, the Stone I know second to least. I don't know Charlie Watts at all, and not having known Brian doesn't count since he's dead. I've never paid much attention to Bill, so it wasn't until a few years ago when we were both shooting the movie Eat the Rich that I got a clear glimpse of his character. It blew me away. I'd seen men like him before, in the States mostly. Older guys with lots of gold and chest hair sticking out of their shirt fronts. Guys who hang around coffee shops near high schools. I just didn't know the type came in a model that's also a Rolling Stone. Two other Stones I knew quite well in the early days were Ron Wood, when he was still with the Faces. He's the nicest man on the planet. And Mick Taylor, when he was married to a witch. Well, maybe she was just a bitch, but anyway, more on that later. For now, Mr. Jagger. David was thrilled when the mighty Mick first paid attention to him. The Stones were from his own middle-class suburban South London, and they'd been by far the most successful local heroes on the scene. They were the very top big boys, up to their necks in sex and drugs and money, while the little boys, David and his friends, were still drawing allowance from their dads. Some of the seminal adventures of David's adolescence, as he told me when we traded our life stories, were played out to a soundtrack of Rolling Stones music. David and Mick became very fast friends very quickly, and it was rather amusing for the rest of us. They were always yakking on the phone together like teenagers, or going to see each other at the studio, or inviting each other over to hear their mixes. I wasn't much involved. I'd been to Mick and Bianca's house and tried to be friendly with Bianca, but she was very reserved, and nothing I did seemed to break the ice. I think she was uncomfortable because of my friendship with Marianne Faithfull. Oh well, I've endured worse disappointments. My appearances at the Jaggers were infrequent, therefore. I remember only 2 visits with any clarity. One was when I was on some sort of business for David, and Mick was working with Mick Taylor on the song that would become Angie, and the other for Mick's birthday party. There was a lot of that sort of thing in our circle, and indeed in London in general, partly because the city is so spread out and difficult to negotiate in the middle of the night, and partly because the English have long been accustomed to intimately shared living quarters. Our friends thought nothing of staying over at our house after a party, or whatever, or of our crashing at their places. It was no big deal. You found somewhere to sleep and claimed it, not worrying much about other bodies scattered here and there. But to some people, I suppose it seemed odd. Middle-class American visitors, representatives of the only society on earth rich enough to have grown accustomed to living one to a room, often tend to be shocked, thinking such arrangements unsanitary and probably even immoral. Perhaps that's why such a furor of publicity erupted when, as a guest on Joan Rivers' talk show, I mentioned that one morning I came upon David and Mick sharing a bed. I had just flown back to London from New York. I entered the house on Oakley Street, went into the kitchen, and Daniela told me, "I think Mick and David are asleep upstairs." I said, "Oh, okay." Went up, opened the bedroom door, and they were indeed asleep in our bed. I asked them if they wanted coffee, and they said yes, and that was that. There are 2 ways of looking at that incident. One was that it was just a thoroughly normal London scene. Best friends stagger home drunk or stoned from some night spot or party or whatever, strip off their clothes somehow and fall into bed and pass out. Morning comes, wife arrives with wake-up beverage, hangover begins, life resumes. But oh no, Joan Rivers and her studio and television audience, and every gossip columnist in the world, leapt straight to the other obvious conclusion, which is that since Mick Jagger had been found in bed with David Bowie, Mick must be, gasp, gay, or, even worse, faint, bisexual. Well, leaving aside the question of why on earth that should have been news to anyone who'd paid any attention to the Stones' affairs, particularly the convoluted girlfriend swapping and buddy bonding among Mick, Keith, and Brian, before Brian ended up in that swimming pool, I really don't like the automatic assumption that if 2 men are found in bed together, something sexual must be happening. It's so square, so typically American. On the other hand, however, I think the assumption was correct. Or to put it another way, when I walked into that room and found Mick and David together, I felt absolutely dead certain that they'd been screwing. It was so obvious, in fact, that I had never even considered the possibility that they hadn't been screwing. The way they'd been running around together and the way David made a virtual religion of slipping the lance of love into almost everyone around him, and then the fact that Mick had a perfectly good bed of his own just 300 yards away from where he was passed out naked with David. It all added up, inescapably, in my mind as well as my gut. I didn't have to look around for open jars of KY. Maybe I should have, because then my eyes would have seen the proof of what I knew in my heart. But I didn't. So I can't say conclusively that those two alley cats were actually going at it that night. While they were still awake together in my bed, I wasn't there. But I was there another time Mick got his pecker up. It was in New York at the Sherry Netherlands suite where I was staying with Dana. David, if I recall correctly, was on tour. Maybe not, but he was just off doing his cocaine thing somewhere. One evening, Dana was in one of the bedrooms of the suite sleeping off jet lag when Mick called for her. I told him she was still passed out, and he said, "Oh, who's that? Is that you, Angie?" "Yeah? Oh, well, I'm going to come over and visit, all right." He was staying at the plaza just across from the Sherry Netherland, so it didn't take him long. He arrived and we said hello, and I asked, well, should I raise Dana? She should get up now anyway, or she'll screw up her body clock completely. No, let her sleep, he replied, and the way he said it was loaded. Very coy, very suggestive. I looked at him, and sure enough, there was a little leer on his face. I thought, Jesus, he wants to make love to me, his best friend's wife, ho, ho, ho. Playing for time, I offered him a drink. He asked for some kind of Courvoisier thing he and David were drinking at the time, and I went into the kitchen and made it for him, then took it back into the living room. He came on strong then, suggesting quite bluntly that we get it on right then and there. I protested. I'm your best friend's wife, Mick. I'm married to David, remember? But he kept at it, and after a while I thought, what the hell, why fight it? Let him do his thing, and let's see what happens. He went to it. I cooperated, but I couldn't get into the spirit of the thing. All the time he was kissing me and feeling me up, an image that had hit me when he first came in the door kept flashing into my mind. Mick as a billy goat. It was one of those peculiar moments when you suddenly see something in a person for the first time, and it's so vivid and obvious that it seems the most essential truth about them, and you wonder why on earth you've never seen it before. That's it, I kept thinking. That mouth, that strut, that uppity way he has. He's a billy goat, and he behaves just like a billy goat. That perception wasn't very erotic, so I was beginning to have a problem taking Mick's attentions very seriously. Frankly, it was all I could do not to burst out laughing when Dana saved the day. She emerged from the bedroom and saw what was happening, and being Dana, reacted appropriately. Ooh, good, she laughed. Fun antics. I think I'll go, I said quickly. She laughed, and off I went. I don't know how I'd have handled Mick if Dana hadn't shown up on cue. I'd have been forced to stop him one way or another, I think, because another anti-erotic theme was accompanying the billy goat refrain in my mind. I kept thinking of all the people I knew Mick had slept with in the previous 3 or 4 months, then imagining how many more there must have been and calculating the odds. Any way I figured it, I realized he was the walking definition of an absolutely unacceptable risk. I liked Mick and his place, but he was such a slut. I dismissed the whole affair as a silly ego and hormone-driven incident, and almost forgot about it. But then the Stones released Angie, with Mick singing that plaintive lyric at someone with my name, and I had to wonder, did our brief, unconsummated encounter mean more to him than I'd ever imagined? I realized the answer to that question was no. Mick's pass at me was one thing, And Angie was another. It was probably just the latest example of the legendary acumen of the Jagger Richards songwriting and publishing team. Those boys used every trick in the book when it came to getting their songs noticed, and I'm sure they weren't above using my name for the sole and simple purpose of causing Stones fans, gossip columnists, and inquiring minds everywhere to wonder, just as I did, what's this? Is Mick in love with David Bowie's wife? There are levels to this. Beyond Mick's goatishness, beyond the male bonding and rock star companionship between him and David, there was something else. Competition. David, you see, wasn't into respecting his elders, and he certainly wasn't into restraining his ego. He listened to that voice religiously, and in 1974 it was telling him, among other things, that he was the biggest, brightest, best rock star in the world. David Bowie, not Mick Jagger, was the one. Mick was last year's rock star, a little long in the tooth, perhaps more suited to life in the pasture, and if there was a hidden theme underlying David's attitude toward him, it was move over, old man, young man coming through. David didn't have to be obvious about it, and he wasn't. Most of the time the charts and the headlines delivered the message for him. He simply added the occasional subtle reinforcement, such as his recording of Let's Spend the Night Together. When you cut a new version of a song so firmly identified with the original artist, you're paying tribute, naturally, and that's good. You're flattering. But if you have the status David had, you're also staking your own claim to the song's glory and history. And in this case, I have no doubt whatsoever that David was out to steal Stone's thunder. He was tomcatting the turf, spraying young scent over the old cats. All of which is just normal human stuff. The usual flack between ambitious people going for the same goals. It's no big deal. Business and personal relations and even friendships survive. It's not fatal. But in this case, it nearly was, and I was the near fatality. Here, Rose Taylor enters my story. Rose, the wife of Mick Taylor, Stone's guitarist and writer of the melody that became Angie, when the main Mick wrote the lyrics. Rose, the girlfriend of Roy Martin before I came along. Rose, the survivor. Rose, the ruthless. Rose, the familiar. And perhaps the practitioner of magic. I never liked her particularly. Her cold self-interest showed through her polite veneer a little too starkly. But I didn't actually begin to loathe her until she was very nearly responsible for my untimely demise. It happened at a West End movie premiere in town, a James Bond movie, I think it was. I was dressed to the nines, out in public with at least a couple of dozen paparazzi ready to pounce. She and I were off to the side of the theater lobby in a semi-private nook, feeling festive. And she said, "Angie, here, put your face down, snort this." I looked into the palm of her hand, saw a little mirror with a line of white powder I assumed to be cocaine. I thought, oh, what the hell, why not? And did it. Inclined my head as discreetly as possible and snorted the stuff. It wasn't cocaine, though. It was heroin. A very stiff jolt of very pure heroin indeed, and it did exactly what it was supposed to do. My lights went out as if somebody had hit the master switch. I keeled straight over backward, and my heart stopped. Luckily, Roy caught me before I fell all the way, or the meeting of my skull on the marble floor could easily have killed me. Roy's reaction saved me. He slapped me conscious and whisked me out of the lobby into the car double quick, then worked on me with mouth-to-mouth resuscitation when I faded away again. Without him, I know I wouldn't have made it. And wouldn't that have been nice? Can't you just see the photos and read the headlines that would have been splashed across every newspaper in Britain and half the world the next day? Bowie's wife takes fatal heroin overdose at West End opening. Angela Bowie, drug addict, dead at 25. And me right there in my fabulous evening dress, cold as a fish on a plate in grainy, flashlit black and white. Quite apart from killing the Angie of Mick Taylor's melody and removing me as a rival for Roy Martin, my death would have done wonders for David's popularity, now wouldn't it? Heroin addiction used to be pretty big, bad news in England, even in music circles. I would, in fact, have been a real trendsetter had I died, the first undeniable pop heroin death on British public record, and I don't think there's any doubt that David's career would have suffered significantly. His challenge to the Stones' supremacy might well have faded in the marketplace, where everyone could see it, as well as in darker, more elemental arenas. So I may have been putting 2 and 2 together and getting 5 when I wondered about the strength of the smack given to me. I really didn't know what to think. For one thing, she didn't act contrite in the least. There was no, "Angie, I'm sorry. I thought you knew it was smack. I thought you were probably used to it. I'd never have offered it to you otherwise. And what's more, it happened again." I was casually shoved a line of speedball mix, half Coke and half smack, and offered a straw. I looked at that innocent little mound of white powder, checking out the size of the dose and factoring in the level of purity common to that group's drugs. "No, thank you, dear," I said. "I'll just take a little bit from the side. The whole thing is enough to kill a fucking horse." And sure enough, judging from how stoned I got, it was. After that, I started to fear and loathe the woman in earnest, wishing her the worst and hoping that one day I'd have the chance to inflict some major inconvenience on her. As it happened, though, I didn't have to do a thing. She and Mick Taylor split up soon after those drug incidents. I don't know why. And then the Stones and Mick parted company, reportedly because Mick's heroin habit had started getting in the way of his work rather seriously. So Rose lost her spot in the center of the inner circle of rock royalty and became the ex-wife of an ex-Rolling Stone. I think she deserved worse, but c'est la vie. There would be a final act in the messy saga of Angie and relations between Mick Jagger and David and me, but I'll save it for later, the way it was saved for me. If what follows compromises the note of dire human drama I've just sounded, it's because I can't write about the Stones without passing along a story I've heard on very good authority. This is one of those rock and roll moments that if it didn't happen, it really should have. During the Steel Wheels tour, the Stones office received a request that, while not unheard of, was rather unusual. There was, it seemed, a young man of 14 or so who was suffering from an extremely rare condition that ages a person very rapidly, long before their prime. The disease was terminal, and the boy in question was well down the road. He already looked bizarre, with many of the features of a 70-year-old imposed on his 14-year-old self. He was bald, and he talked through a voice box in his larynx, and he was going to die. But before he did, he said he had one great wish: to meet the Rolling Stones. Management talked to the Stones about it, and the Stones agreed, and an invitation was sent out, along with plane tickets to a Stones concert. Everything went according to plan, and on the appointed night, the young man showed up backstage before the show. Management had prepped Mick and the others as thoroughly as possible, but even so, the encounter was awkward. There was the very distinct feeling that the sooner it was over, the better. Looking that strange and sounding that strange, the kid seemed almost more alien than human. The Stones had shaken hands and exchanged small talk for almost long enough when someone, I don't know who, posed the question to the boy. "Well, is there anything we can do for you?" This was supposed to be the moment in which T-shirts or tour jackets or perhaps more extravagant gifts are forthcoming, and those items were, of course, close at hand, but such was not to be. The standard script took a sudden, wild turn. "Yes, there is something," said the kid in that weird voice. "I want to get high and I want a blowjob." There was stunned silence until Keith, who else, started laughing, then laughing harder, then laughing so hard that he had to fall down and convulse on the floor. You should know the ending of this story already, but in case you can't figure it out for yourself, here it is. The kid got high and watched the show, and later a prepaid, well-briefed call girl came by his hotel room, and he got his blowjob. I like all kinds of stuff about this story, but what I most enjoy is thinking about what must have been a wonderful moment. Just imagine how that kid must have felt when sitting there at home in his condition and wanting what he wanted before his disease ran its course. The light bulb went on, and he finally figured out a virtually guaranteed, all-expense-paid way of getting it. He must have known his stones. He must have known there was no way they would even consider refusing him. David had the United States, New York, and cocaine in the summer of 1974. I had the United Kingdom, London, and Pamela. Pamela was my friend. She was a drug, and she was the best argument I've ever known for the proposition that not all drugs are destructive. She certainly proved that some drugs are better than others. Pamela took you as far as you can imagine from the stupor of smack or the mania of cocaine. I never knew exactly what Pamela was, what chemical formula the letters PMA denoted. Its designer told me recently that it was only one molecule away from the drug called ecstasy today. Basically, it was a limited edition psychedelic that had all of the beneficent effects of the better mass-market products. The euphoria, the sensory glow, without the usual drawbacks, the wild hallucinations, the physical tension, the risky edge aspect of the psychedelic experience. Concocted by a London pharmacist for people like me and my circle, it came in the form of a white powder that we mixed into juice and tripped on for about 6 hours, perhaps with a little booster after a couple of hours. It was very powerful, but it was gentle too. Extraordinarily sensual. It enhanced physical experience so that whatever turned you on, dancing, bathing, dressing up in silks and satins, gave you almost orgasmic pleasure. Making love on PMA gave you orgasms that were out of this world. All was well at Oakley Street, but Chelsea wasn't the whole world. More to the point, it wasn't New York. And it wasn't David's domain. I was still enthralled to that domain, though, so from time to time I had to leave the London scene and go wherever David was. Wherever David was, it was cocaine chilly, and often very strange. But being with him certainly had its moments. In his personal life, he'd hollowed out a bleak little cavern of an existence, using an unattractive brownstone on West 17th Street as a base for himself and his loyal band of sycophants that was plain sad. His life seemed full of lonely drugging and obsessive work, and that was about it. But of course, all the energy poured into his work was doing wonders for his professional life. The new music was wonderful. Diamond Dogs, the album and the tour, was by far his most ambitious work to date, and it succeeded magnificently. The whole project, from the conception of the album to the refinements of David's choreography around Jules Fisher's breathtaking stage set for the tour, was a triumph. The basic notion, with its weave of sci-fi, shock, totalitarian mutation themes, was a brilliant synthesis of Kafka, Dali, Genet, Burroughs, Orwell, Huxley, and all the other underground thinkers conversing in David's head. He did a great job of translating their ideas into ticket-selling, brain-bending rock and roll theater. The songs were tight and smart and effective, high-power rock at its rhythmic, melodic peak. The band, 8 instrumentalists and 2 dancer backup singers now, were fabulous. The costumes and the choreography were stunning. The set, the lighting, props, and effects were wild. Nobody in rock had ever considered going on the road with anything even remotely that ambitious. It was like going out with a state-of-the-art Broadway show, setting it up and tearing it down every night. David wasn't performing a concert. He was starring in a full-scale dramatic production, the first rock opera to be produced and performed as such. Until the Diamond Dogs tour, fans had had to concoct their own visual fantasies from whatever stimuli were available in the average concert hall, usually just back projection and brain chemistry supplements. Before David, there were only the light shows of Pink Floyd and the San Francisco psychedelic crowd. Since David, of course, there's been all kinds of stuff. Everything up to the current benchmark of pop theatricality, the Michael Jackson Roadshow. But I don't think there's ever been anything to match Diamond Dogs. Plenty of shows have been bigger, the expenditure of effort and funds more conspicuous by far. But none has been brighter. None has tried to mean as much or succeeded in communicating its meaning as effectively. Now, back to the central, now sorry saga of David and me, and a very major development on that front, a new true love. Kirk was his name. Just Kirk, no surname. He was Todd Rundgren's hair and makeup artist, among other things, and that's how I met him. Todd's girlfriend, Bebe Buell, put us together at Max's Kansas City in the spring of 1974, just after David had established residence in New York. It was Lee Black Shoulders who really introduced us, though. Drifting past as a companion and I laughed and parried, getting to know each other at the bar, Lee said, "Before you get too excited about that girl, Angie, you'd better feel between her legs." I looked up, a little dazed from all the fun. "What did you say?" By then, Lee was already gone, so I looked inquiringly at the lovely young thing I'd been romancing. And she really was lovely. Shoulder-length ash-blonde hair, turquoise eyes under high, arched brows, a fine nose, full lips, a sweetheart chin, perfect makeup, tight black, glitter and leather rock and roll clothes. In short, luscious. She spoke. "I think that what he was trying to tell you is that I'm a boy." I almost couldn't believe it. Even after I'd slipped my hand down to his package and checked for myself, he was just so utterly lovely. The only man I'd ever met, in fact, who was as purely pretty as David. And like David, he was as strong and athletic as he was lovely. My initial impression of a slight, delicate physique was surprisingly far from the reality of his supple, well-muscled body. David's graceful strength came from dancing the boards on English stages. Kirk's came from dancing the surf of his native Florida. There, however, the similarity ended. When Kirk fell in love with me, he looked on it as a commitment. He wanted to be monogamous and to make me happy and to support me in my career. He paid attention to me and took me seriously and let me have as much power and space in the relationship as he had. And he was a strong, subtle, powerful, sensitive, brilliant lover who really wanted me in the best of ways. Feeling his warmth turn towards me was like being carried out into the Mediterranean sun from a cold, gray English sick room, and the chills and fevers of my love for David began to fade away beneath this new, sweeter, simpler spell. My feelings for David were still very strong, especially my loyalty to his art and my profound concern for his well-being. And from time to time, he and I were even warm together, achieving brief moments of the kind of instinctive communication we once had every day. But more and more the chill won out. David had become terribly hard to love. I fell for Kirk then and fell hard. Soon I realized that he was the big time, that this was real love. He and I were together whenever our other commitments allowed, through 1974 and into 1975. That is, whenever he wasn't on the road with Todd or some other rocker in need of high styling, and whenever I was in New York. Most of our time together was spent at the apartment I'd rented on 21st Street, near but far enough from David's house of chilly horrors on 17th, and it was in that apartment that Kirk's realistic support and counsel began to convince me that when the chips were really down concerning my career, and indeed my life, my future, I might actually be better off without David than with him. I mean, what are they really doing for you? Kirk asked. Is Tony helping you get work in the theater? Is David giving you the love and attention a man owes his wife? Does either of them really give a fuck about you other than having you available when they need something done? The answers to those three questions, I had to admit, were no, no, and no. This was food for thought, and my thoughts were indeed nourished. The idea of bailing out from Starship Bowie, just walking away from the chill into warmth and freedom, and to hell with the so-called wealth and second-hand status of the pop star wife, became quite attractive, and I started to consider it seriously. It was partly at Kirk's prompting and with his wholehearted encouragement that in the first months of 1975, I secured a booking on the Mike Douglas show. This time I wasn't appearing just as a David Bowie shill or substitute, although I was doing that. His album Young Americans needed promoting, but for the first time as a performer in my own right. I was going to sing I've Got a Crush on You to Mike and use every ounce of craft I'd learned over the previous 2 years from my Hollywood voice coach, the wonderful Harriet Lee. Our sights had been set on the Broadway stage, so that song was perfect for my debut in a singing career before a national TV audience. Kirk came with me to Philadelphia for the taping, and of course he made me up and styled my hair exquisitely. He was proud of his work, and justifiably so. But on this occasion, in my opinion, his ego got a bit too involved. When the Douglas people wanted to add their own makeup work to balance me for the studio lighting, he objected huffily. I saw their point and supported it, and he didn't like that. And I didn't like him for not liking it, and soon we had ourselves a little tiff. I went ahead and sang my song, and did quite well, thank you. But that wasn't really the end of our fight. The whole silly subject came up again when we were back at our hotel. It was nothing, of course, but it created a tension between us, and the tension turned into something. And how? The spark was a story in that day's Philadelphia Inquirer, a cute little paparazzo special that was to ruin the next few years of my life. Kirk handed it to me in our room, and I felt my blood go from warm to boiling hot by the time I'd read the lead. My husband, it seemed, had been spotted on the Spanish Riviera in the company of our son Zoe and Mick Jagger's wife, Bianca. I wanted to kill him, not just because he was with Bianca, but because Zoe was there. For all my exploits, I always tried to shield Zoe from the more decadent parts of our life. He was, after all, still a child. Kirk made a big mistake at this point. Or maybe he didn't. I was so angry that probably I'd have turned on him no matter how he'd acted. Whatever the case, he started in on a theme he'd aired before. "You should leave him, Angie," he said. "This is just another example of why. He can't treat you like this. You deserve better. That's as far as he got. "You what?" I shouted. "How are you any different? All you care about is your fucking art and your fucking ego and your fucking self." And so on, and so on. I was out of control, letting it rip, saying whatever I thought could do damage, just lashing out because I was hurt and angry, and he was there. I raved until I felt my grand exit coming on, and then I stormed out of the room, slammed the door, went down to the lobby, had the hotel call me a cab, and took it all the way out of Pennsylvania and back up the New Jersey Turnpike to Manhattan. That was a grand exit indeed, and evidently it made quite an impression on Kirk. He didn't call, write, send a telegram, or even have a dozen red roses delivered in the next few days. I didn't go out of my way to reach him either, and that's where things stood when my schedule called for me to go back to London. That's where they still stood when I got a transatlantic phone call from Lee a week or so later. Kirk was dead. He'd been drinking with a couple of gay guys in their apartment, a fifth-floor walk-up, and he'd fallen from the fire escape and been killed instantly. Maybe he'd fallen, Lee said. Maybe he'd been pushed. The word was that maybe those guys had wanted to fuck him and he wouldn't go along with it, and they'd gotten angry and they were all drunk. Or maybe it was just that they were all drunk. Or maybe it didn't matter, did it? Either way, Kirk was dead, gone. His beautiful head had been cracked and crushed, smashed open. All his warm, wonderful life exploded out of it, on the street of that wretched cesspool of a city. I can't even begin to describe the black plague of despair, depression, and guilt that came into me then. I didn't recover. I denied. I drank my PMA-laced fruit juice in my lovely house with my lovely friends and had a lovely time. And everything was just fine. My husband had seen my performance on the Mike Douglas show, he told me, and had written a new song for me, Golden Years. He sang it over the phone for me, just the way all those years before he'd sung me The Prettiest Star. It had a similar effect. I bought it. Even if David was never actually there with me, I thought, we'd always be together, just as in the song. I had a very great need, you see, for things to feel all right. I didn't take any action then. I remained Mrs. Bowie and stayed at my post. Things were not just fine at all, though. They were, in fact, going to hell, literally. I found that out once again via a transatlantic telephone call. This time it was David on the other end, or at least the creature David had become, a friend-abusing, sense-mangling, money-bleeding, full-fledged vampire of velocity. Like coke addicts long before and after him, he'd learned to travel far and fast, to keep his mind spinning in tight little circles, even when standing perfectly still, to arrange an existence almost entirely devoid of daylight, to assume a world-view of utter paranoia. In his case, no great stretch, and to start slowly sucking the life out of everybody close to him. He was calling me from Los Angeles, only half a world away from Oakley Street. But from the way he sounded, he might just as well have been off in the emptiness of some awful cold black hole, out there in the timeless infinity far beyond the reach of warmth and earthly human feeling. He said he was with the devil, or more specifically, that he was about to be with the devil. He was in a house somewhere, he didn't know exactly where, except that it was in L.A., and 3 people, a warlock and 2 witches, were holding him for some terrible Satan-related reason he kept trying, very incoherently, to explain. He wanted to get away, he said, but he didn't have any money and he didn't know where he was, and anyway the witches wouldn't let him leave. He was talking in slurred, hushed tones, and hardly making sense, and was crazed with fear. He sounded really spooky. I'd heard David speaking from some pretty cold, strange places, both by telephone and in person, but this sounded different, worse than I'd heard before. I got scared and insisted that he give me the number where he was, telling him he couldn't keep it a secret the way he liked to. It's a measure of how frightened he was that he gave it to me before he hung up the phone, or someone hung up for him. Rattled, I called Los Angeles immediately, and much to my relief reached Michael Lipman, the new manager with whom David was rearranging his affairs. I should, I guess, relate to you the story of Michael's entrance on the scene and the sorry tale of David's ultimate disaffection with Tony DeFries, but not in detail. It's entirely too tedious. Essentially, David tired of having no access to his money, particularly since he needed such large amounts of it so frequently in cash without a paper trail. For his part, Tony tired, or so I gather, of the way David resented him, refused his advice, and behaved in the standard out-of-control addict fashion, which is to say, paranoid, compulsive, abusive, and irrational. Michael Lipman saw an opportunity opening in David's career and took it. But back in Los Angeles, where we left David, still detained by witches in an undisclosed location, me on the phone with Michael Lippman, giving him the telephone number David had given me. Since Michael was both on good terms with David and in the same city, I told him maybe he should call the number. Maybe he could get a better fix on the situation than I could. He agreed, and I hung up and waited. When he called me back, he too was worried. He hadn't liked the way David had sounded, he said, so he told him just to walk out into the street wherever he was, find a taxi, and go straight to the Lippmans' house in the Hollywood Hills. Michael could pay the taxi off, and he and his wife could help chase the witches away if they followed. David had agreed to that. Praying that David had taken Michael's advice and determined to motivate him out the door if he hadn't, I called the witch's number. A woman answered, but I couldn't get any sense out of her, and I could hear people laughing crazily in the background. I listened to the gibberish coming at me across the Atlantic from that house in California, feeling a great sense of dread. And right then I decided to catch a plane. Duty very plainly, unavoidably, had called. I left that night. Looking down at the receding lights of Heathrow, I knew I was saying goodbye to civilization and heading into who knew what hell on earth in Hollywood. It's not as if the beast is any stranger in the Hollywood Hills, wherever you have a concentration of exceptionally ambitious, utterly amoral egomaniacs locked in throat-slashingly ruthless competition with each other, which is as good a description of the Los Angeles movie community as any I can think of. Some genius is going to hit on the idea of a career boost from Satan. I'm not kidding. Hollywood is very likely the most active occult area on the planet, and it's been that way for decades. The black arts are established to the point of being ingrained, and in the mid-70s they were thriving as never before or since. I knew that, so it wasn't any great surprise when transported intercontinentally to Michael and Nancy Lippman's house, I heard David's explanation of what went on between him and those witches, from whom he'd escaped just as Michael had advised, by walking out and hailing a cab. The deal, he said, was that those people wanted his semen. They wanted to hold him and cast a spell over him, again, I'm not kidding, so that he could inseminate one of the witches in a ritual ceremony on All Saints' Eve, and thereby bring an offspring of Satan into the world. Well, I thought, fancy that. The things a few grams of cocaine can do to inspire people. David's tale had lots of color and even greater grandiosity, but like most coke fantasies, it lacked any real spark, any true imagination. You watch Rosemary's Baby, then spend 2 days snorting 3-inch lines every 15 minutes in the company of some scumbag dealer and his coke horse, and presto! You're a poor little Mia Farrow and the big old power-procreating beast man rolled into one. An exceptionally interesting outing for the Lance of Love. Even in his paranoid fantasies, David was leading with his dick. I didn't know whether to laugh in his face or go cry in a corner. The idea of anyone thinking they'd actually have to force David Bowie to exercise Lance was pretty funny under any circumstances. On the other hand, the spiritual degradation demonstrated by his story was really sad. So I just straightened up and did my job. Angie would fix things, be the nurse and the cook and the voice of reason, make it all okay until next time. That was the way it went. Despite my unsuitability as a drugging companion, David found me very acceptable, even indispensable when too much got to be too much, and he started scaring himself. My first task, I perceived, was to get some food into him, the idea being that food might slow him down enough to consider the even better idea of sleep. I had to buy and prepare the food myself, though, since, so David explained, Michael and Nancy would try to poison him if given the chance. Having communicated that essential item, he went off to the guest room to do some more toot. I went off to the supermarket. When I came back, loaded with all his favorite delicacies, he was in a state of utter panic because I'd been gone so long. I calmed him down a little, then put a foot wrong. "Babe, I think it might be a good idea if you stopped doing the cocaine for a little while. You know how it takes your appetite away and you need to eat, so you might want to let up until you've eaten." Dumb mistake. "Don't tell me what to do," he yelled. "Don't you tell me what to do," and he went into his room, slamming the door. Sniffing noises ensued. As the afternoon wore on, he wouldn't come out of his room. Finally, after endless soothing talk from Michael and me, he opened the door. Very soon we wished he hadn't. The problem was straight across the hallway, on the wall of a room Michael and Nancy were using as a home office. A photograph of David and me taken in Paris in happier times, with him in a white suit and me in a white dress. David took one look at the photograph and freaked right out. He stood there, death-white, rigid and shaking, pointing at the picture, with a look of total horror on his face. And it got worse. The shaking intensified very quickly, and I began to lose it. It occurred to me, in a wave of sudden fear, that David was plunging into a cocaine-induced epileptic seizure, which could kill him. People die in such states, literally shaking themselves to death, snapping their heads back and forth so hard that they break their necks. It didn't get that far, though. With Michael, Nancy, and me in his face demanding to know what was going on, David was able to spit it out. In the photograph, he told us in his terror-stricken tremor, his arm encircling my waist was black. Well, so it was, or at least it was dark. And although there was no big deal to anyone else, it was a shadow, a quirk of exposure or printing. Whatever, who cared? To David, it was the kiss of death. In his scheme of things, the fact that his arm around my waist was black meant that the witches were going to kill me as a way of getting to him. It signified, moreover, that their thrall had penetrated into his immediate environment. So back into his room he ran, and the door slammed shut again. Creative solutions were called for now. If David couldn't save himself by making a transition to my rationale, then I had to adopt his. I had to jump into that nest of spooks and demons with him and deal with them on his terms. Fortunately, I had the means of doing that. In my address book was the telephone number of Wally Elmlark, a very respectable white witch whom David and I had met in London while she was working with Robert Fripp on some weird ESP album project. Wally was great. She really knew her stuff, and she even looked the part, very pale and gothic, with good gypsy Slavic cheekbones, and to my great good fortune, she was home to take my call. I explained the situation to her, and she gave me a prescription over the phone, the ritual scattering of household herbs, she said, together with certain readings from the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which David had kept handy since his Buddhist monk wannabe days, should temporarily restore a relatively even keel. The news that I had a plan from Wally was in itself comforting to David, and he began to calm down. He even agreed to eat. If, that is, I and only I touched his food. I went into the kitchen, prepared him a tray, and took it to his room. I didn't notice it at first. David had to point it out to me. On a nice, balmy Hollywood late afternoon, a storm was going on outside his window. Rain, thunder, lightning, the works. Outside all the other windows in the house, there was calm and sunshine. I stood there looking at this thing, sort of numb, then snapped out of it, resumed my Angie Fix-It role, and proposed reassuring points about the eccentric California climate and the deceptive topography of the Hollywood Hills. I did a pretty good job, but all the same, it took a long time to pacify David after this latest manifestation. He didn't get to sleep until quite late that evening. David finally began to break free from his satanic obsessions. It seemed as if we were to be spared further problems with demons, warlocks, and witches. At the same time, a threat already in place began really asserting itself. The awful Corinne Schwab fired up her campaign for exclusive rights to David Bowie, body and soul. My troubles with witches may have been over, but my troubles with bitches had only just begun. Corinne Schwab, it was I who first marked her as a potential candidate for the job of David's personal assistant. I noticed how hard she worked when she first showed up as a temp at the London main man office. She had both devotion and determination, and would surely get done what you asked her to do, and so I befriended her and recommended her to David. It didn't hurt, I thought, that she seemed to get along quite well with Tony DeFries. All kinds of static could be avoided if David had a go-between, loyal to him and also liked by Tony in his dealings with Main Man. And Corinne was indeed loyal to David. I figured she would be, right from the start, because she had that worshipful, doggy look in her eyes whenever the Great One came within her orbit. Hers wasn't any passing adulation either. She's still with him today, having stuck like glue through absolutely everything. Of the many acolytes at the altar of the Church of David Bowie, then, Corinne turned out to be both the most enduring and the most privileged. How intimate she became with David, I don't know. Clearly, though, the woman was bad news. Bad news for people wanting something from David, because they'd have to go through her to get to him. And extra bad news for me, for that same reason. David used Corinne for everything. Fetching his drinks, summoning his concubines, doing whatever needed doing. But most especially he used her to restrict access to himself. She became his gatekeeper, and as time went on and his heart hardened further toward me, I became number one on her list of people to be turned away. Her control of the space around David grew quickly. It was she, not I, who found our next house in Bel Air, and therefore it was she who determined what the space around me was going to be like. And it was awful. A dark, horrible house, devoid of light and grace and color. It was the perfect environment for a cave dweller like poor David. In the same category as Corinne, though hardly in the same league, was Candy Clark, chosen by Nicholas Roeg to play the motel maid who became the reclusive alien's lover, protector, and the man who fell to earth. She dropped into my life with all the grace of an incoming scud. She had been drinking before Nick brought her to the house for her first meeting with David. So had Nick. She arrived for the script reading with a bottle of wine under each arm. It was so tacky. Nick kept making sly remarks about what he and Candy had been doing at their hotel before they came over, and dropping playful hints like, "You know, David, you and Candy should get to know each other better. I'm sure she'd love that. Wouldn't you, Candy?" For her part, Candy attacked David and was mauling him like a hungry tiger. Personally, I was shocked, and never quite had the same respect for Nicholas Roeg as he had sat and watched the entire episode. He didn't seem to detect my embarrassment. David looked uncomfortable, but tried to take it in good spirit. Sometime later, I noticed in a newspaper interview that Candy boasted how she and David were warned to calm down during the love scenes shot during the film. Nicholas Roeg said they put too much passion into them. How could there be too much passion in any love scene? When I watch the movie today, I'm amazed by how well it came out. Not so much by Nick Roeg's work, which had been wonderful right from the start, his egomania and drinking notwithstanding, but by David's. Knowing how much coke he was doing and what kind of state he was in, I almost can't believe his performance. There's a core of talent in that man which endured no matter how he abused himself. Talent, though, can't hug you and love you and make it all better. I learned how strong the tie between Corinne and David had grown when one day I asked Corinne rather sharply about the amount of baggage she'd assembled for a trip to Jamaica where David was going to record. She snapped at me. I snapped back at her. "Don't you dare talk to me like that!" And suddenly David hurtled across the room, grabbed my throat in both hands, and started squeezing. He was blindly angry, yelling at me as he tightened his grip, and I started panicking. It didn't feel as if he were going to stop. Corinne pulled him off and saved me. So it's possible, irony of ironies, that I owe her my life. I guess she was just doing her job, though. The great one on trial for murder or manslaughter, or even tainted by some mysterious misfortune visited on his wife, would not have been too cool. Too much hassle in a scenario like that. Far too high a price. A better way could surely be found. I don't mean to suggest that Corinne was the only one who hatched the whole Switzerland scam. She didn't have the vision for something like that. She was born to follow directions, not give them. It started, I think, with the idea of Swiss residency for David as a solution to a pressing tax problem. If David were to remain a resident of California, he would have to pay a hefty tax bill with money he didn't have. These were tax debts accumulated over the previous few years, during which time vast quantities of taxable cash he had generated had vanished into various murky areas, David's nasal cavities being only the most apparent. I began thinking about Switzerland and seeing some positive possibilities. Demons and witches and roadies with bags full of cocaine were in short supply there. And the opposite was abundant. The Western world had been sending its sick, drunk, and addicted for treatment in Switzerland for 100 years and more. "Okay," I said, "this is going to cost some cash, but I guarantee you if you want it, I'll get it done." David agreed. Off to Switzerland I went, straight back to the obvious starting point, the bursar at my old school, St. George's. She connected me to a lawyer specializing in residency situations, and he laid it all out for me. There was much to lay out, for the Swiss are incredibly particular about who gets in and where, and how they can live once they're there. As it turned out, in addition to the tax benefit, David would also benefit from making another kind of move under Swiss law. In California at that time, divorce courts were recognizing the concept of communal property and beginning the bargaining at the 50-50 line. But in Switzerland, the male still reigned supreme. If he played his cards right, any man could get rid of his wife for a song. In the months that followed, David gravitated toward Berlin, while I headed for London. Neither of us lived in those places, of course, because the Swiss take their residency requirements seriously and demand that their resident foreigners spend significant amounts of time at home. Therefore, you stay, or work, or holiday in your London flat, Berlin garret, or wherever, and return to Switzerland when you have to. It's like being on work release from a very nice, court-ordered health resort. My scene in London, but also in New York and other places, wasn't the stuff of fond memories. I could see the writing on the wall for my marriage, so I was trying to establish a separate and independent life for myself. But deep down, I didn't want to deal with what was happening in my life. I was angry, sad, and starting to go crazy. And so I turned to drugs. I began doing heroin, which I'd been sampling recreationally since I'd been introduced to it, on a habitual basis. And I found the perfect companion for that lifestyle. He was a New York musician who had worked as a sound man for the Heartbreakers, Johnny Thunder's out-of-control New York Dolls offshoot of seminal glitter punk hard rockers. He was experienced with heroin. He knew the life. He knew the ropes. And so it all worked out fine. There we were, the archetypically trendy mid-70s match. Just another couple of pale, desperate, black leather music biz junkies in love. David's scene was just as raunchy, but its themes were different. Berlin for him was the terminus of other obsessions of his: German expressionist art, Nazism, and the mystical underpinnings of master race culture. I first heard him talking about the whole dark underworld of Nazism with Lou Reed and Iggy Pop when they came to London. It seemed to have held his imagination with growing power ever since. He wasn't, as the English tabloid press suggested, infatuated with the more simple-minded, racist aspects of Nazi ideology, and indeed he was furious when one London newspaper ran a photo of him apparently giving the stiff-armed fascist salute after arriving at Victoria Station from Berlin. The photographer had caught him in mid-gesture, he explained, and he disavowed any embrace of Nazism in general, and one recently attributed declaration in particular. "I believe Britain could benefit from a fascist leader," he was reported to have said. "After all, fascism is really nationalism." Whatever. I don't happen to think that he ever really bought that philosophy. I think his real interest lay first in causing a stir, and second, as he explained it, in mythology, about the Arthurian period, about the magical side of the whole Nazi campaign. That sounds like the David I knew. And besides, as he later clarified, I was out of my mind totally, completely crazed. I couldn't even begin to relate to either his fascination with the magic behind the Holocaust or his affection for grim, gray places, and that's putting it very mildly indeed. I couldn't stand all that crap, but when he started talking about Romy Haag and her cabaret theater, I got interested. The fact that he was having an affair with Romy was neither here nor there. Sexually, she was just one among many, since he also had his usual selection of boys and black women on tap. But the fact of Romy's talent, as well as the fabulous theatrical action on the stage of her little club, was impressive. Walking into that place was like going back decades, to the Berlin of Christopher Isherwood, the glory days of avant-cabaret before Adolf, the Soviets and the Americans turned underground Berlin into little more than an anything-goes meat rack. Romy was very wild and very sophisticated. Musically, David was in one of his regenerative periods, filling himself back up with something fresh after exhausting his previous obsession. This meant attaching himself to a new source of ideas and energy. In this case, Brian Eno, whom he'd known since Roxy Music opened for Ziggy and the Spiders on the triumphant British tour of 1973. He and Eno created the appropriately titled Low in Berlin. And he was working a lot with Iggy, producing Iggy's Lust for Life album, amongst other things. Maybe he was reaching a turning point in Berlin, or at least reaching for his own personal low. Significantly, he didn't seem to be doing as much cocaine as before, if any. Corinne had found him a therapist in Switzerland, and that might have had something to do with it. But while this revealed a change in consciousness, gee, maybe this stuff is bad for me, it hardly mattered operationally. Virtually every time I saw him in Berlin, he was drunk, or working on getting drunk, and his stress level seemed as high as in his several grams a night days. On one of my visits, he got so worked up he thought he was having a heart attack. I rushed him to the British military hospital, where the doctors checked him out and told him his heart was just fine, but maybe he should relax a little. I didn't enjoy my visits. It was painful enough seeing David, but even worse seeing Zoe, enrolled much against my wishes at a British military school. Or rather, seeing Zoe was great. It was leaving him I couldn't stand. At those times, I couldn't avoid being fully conscious of what exactly was going on. David was casting me off, and that meant he would be taking Zoe with him. Zoe had always been my gift to David, you see. By bearing my fragile husband a child, I was giving him someone to live for. And now especially now, in David's darkest hour of need. I wasn't going to back out on that commitment. So I knew I wouldn't fight for Zoe's custody, and therefore I knew I was going to lose him, which was the worst thing possible for me. It felt like performing an amputation on myself. My anger was very deep and very strong. It went inward and did its work there, poisoning me. But it also had to get out, and in that direction its proper target wasn't within range. David had only two possible responses to anger, as I'd learned from long and bitter experience, and neither did me any good at all. He would become neutral and distant and begin planning your cancellation, or he would snap into violence. The latter had happened with me only once, but it had been enough. Corinne, on the other hand, Corinne was his tool. She was the gatekeeper and the assassin. She did his dirty work for him and took all the consequences. With her by his side, he could behave however he wanted without accepting the responsibility for his actions. In politics and government, they call that being insulated. Corinne then became my focus. Recognizing that David and I couldn't deal with each other as long as he could insert her between us, I made my decision and took my stand. One night during dinner at one of the revolting, typically German restaurants he enjoyed, I stepped out over the abyss. "David," I said, "I need you to fire Corinne." Gravity worked. No angels came to save me. He refused. We talked about divorce then. He asked me to divorce him. I said no. The commitment I'd made at Plasto Grove and before the Registrar of Marriages didn't include giving up and walking away. That left him only one course of action, and he took it. He'd divorce me, he said. It was so strange to have it all finally dealt with, was liberating. It lightened the mood. My mind, I think, was doing a particularly efficient job of assimilating the new information, rationalizing it, and giving it just the right spin to keep my emotions from killing me. "Now that we're not married, it'll be different," went the appealing little refrain. "We can be friends and partners again." I don't know why David was feeling lighter. It was probably simple relief at having finally spoken his mind. But he brightened considerably, and soon we were getting along better than we had in years. For a while we were truly together again. We made love for the first time in years. It went on for 3 days, and those were good times. They had a strangely erotic quality, almost illicit, as if the decision to divorce had changed us from man and wife into brother and sister behaving very naughtily with each other. I started to think that maybe, as in the beginning, we were adventuring into something new, untried, exciting. But that was a fantasy. The reality was Corinne. I'd had a confrontation with her about something or other, and it had ended with her fleeing the apartment, where she had her own room. That was fine as far as I was concerned. The less I saw of Corinne, the better. But David was very upset. He turned his attention from me to the telephone, and while I listened, he called around Berlin looking for her, anxiously, with far more concern than he'd shown for my welfare since our Haddon-Hole days. Finally he found her and left the apartment to meet her. I stood there letting it sink in. Then I went into Corinne's room, gathered up her clothes and some of the gifts I'd given her in better times, threw them out of the window into the street, and called a cab and caught a flight to London. And for David and me, that was the end. David divorced me under Swiss law, the decree becoming final in 1980. He granted me a settlement of $750,000 over 10 years, and nothing else. Because of the bias of Swiss law, the fact that I didn't claim custody of Zoe, and some embarrassing Polaroids Roy Martin supplied to him, David probably didn't even have to give me that much. He insisted on a gag clause stipulating that I could not discuss our marriage in the media for the term of the settlement, which has now expired. David is alive and healthy. He is still living in Switzerland and still inventing fashionable versions of himself with which to keep us entertained. Zoe stayed with his father, the court ordering that he be available to me twice a year. After living in Berlin, he went to school in Lausanne, then attended Gordonston, the ultra-exclusive boarding school of the British elite in Scotland. Around that time, he decided he would be called Joe. Wouldn't you? And a few years later, he also decided that he didn't want to see me or talk to me. Now 21, he's a man I don't know. After Berlin, I saw David one last time in Lausanne, in a cafe midway between our respective lawyers' offices. He was open and even kindly with me, but so what? He was there to sign divorce papers. I was low and sad and confused and stoned. At heart, I felt like killing myself, but I knew I wouldn't. I'd already tried twice, once in Switzerland at Christmas time in 1977, when I arrived to find that Zoe, contrary to my expectations, was in Berlin with David, and once in New York 3 or 4 months later. The second time I almost made it. Only an unexpected visitor saved me. He called the paramedics when he found me in my bathtub, comatose from an overdose of Equinol. I remember the paramedics carelessly dropping me down 2 flights of stairs on the way to the ambulance, and me wondering if they were trying to tell me something. Suicide isn't pretty, baby. Either do it right or don't do it at all. I ran away from New York, the junkie life and clinical depression after that. Headed for California, good friends, new beginnings. I quit trying to kill myself, found new adventures, lots of them, all over the world, with all sorts of wild and wonderful people. I lived through some simply terrible times, another failed marriage for one, and I was given some even greater blessings, my daughter Stasha above all. But that's another story. Suffice it to say that the years since I was with David have not been dull, and if I have anything to do with it, the future won't be either. Looking back, I can see that my life with David was molded by forces beyond my control and even my understanding. I never realized how powerless I was against his secretiveness, his emotional frigidity, or his addictive nature. Now I know that there was nothing I could have done, and also that nothing I did do really mattered. He had a date with his own personal hell, no matter what. C'est la vie. I truly regret, though, that he never came out and told me what he wanted of me until it was far too late. I'll never really know whether I'd have been willing to play a traditional wife and mother's role in a conventional marriage with him, but I sure would have liked to have been offered that option. You never know, I might have taken it. As it was, I got neither real marriage nor real openness out of the open marriage I thought we had, and in the end, I was shut out of everything. Still, I don't regret trying. I still believe in the principles I brought to our relationship, and I still practice them, and I'm still proud of what I did to get those ideas heard. Regardless of his performance with me, David did do a wonderful job of broadcasting sexual freedom and personal liberation. He shone his light into a lot of dark places in people and helped them see themselves and maybe love themselves a little better. And even though it hurts sometimes, I wouldn't have missed it for the world. It was one hell of a party.